Edwin Harrow didn't even look up from his desk when he said it. "You're 18 today. That means we're done." He slid a folded paper across the mahogany surface without standing, without meeting her eyes, the way a man might pass a receipt to a cashier. $20. A deed to some abandoned property up in the mountains that nobody in Ironwood Pass had touched in 30 years. Lenora stood to the door of the study where she had never once been invited to sit down. Her coat was too thin for October. She had 17 cents of her own money in her left pocket. "That cabin," Edwin said, finally glancing up, "isn't worth the paper the deed is printed on. Neither was your mother's judgment in keeping you this long." He went back to his ledger. The door didn't slam. That would have required him to care enough to slam it. "Before we go any further, if you've ever been thrown away by someone who was supposed to protect you, or if you've ever watched someone survive something that should have broken them, stay with us. Hit that subscribe button right now, because the story you're about to hear is going to follow Lenora Veyne all the way from the worst night of her life to something Edwin Harrow never saw coming. Drop a like on this video and tell us in the comments what city or country you're watching from. We want to see how far this story travels. Don't miss what comes next. You won't regret staying. The morning of Lenora Veyne's 18th birthday began the same way most mornings in the South household began, with the sound of Edwin's boots on the hardwood floor downstairs, precise and unhurried, the footsteps of a man who had organized every corner of his life and considered disorder a personal insult. Lenora heard them from her room on the 3rd floor, the room that had once been used for storing trunks before her mother, Clara, had quietly moved her things up there and told her it was temporary. That was 4 years ago. The trunks were still there, shoved against the far wall, and Lenora had learned to sleep around them. She was already dressed when she came downstairs. She had been awake since 4. Not because she was excited. She hadn't been excited about a birthday since she was 11, before her grandfather Bram got sick, before the world started peeling away one layer at a time. She was awake because something in her chest had spent the whole night pulling at her like a fishhook. Some instinct she couldn't name, telling her that today was not going to be ordinary, telling her to be ready. She didn't know what she was supposed to be ready for. She found out at the breakfast table. Edwin was already seated. He had not set a second place. There was 1 cup of coffee, 1 plate of toast, 1 folded newspaper beside his right hand. He didn't look up when Lenora came in. He waited until she had stopped moving, until the room was perfectly quiet, except for the clock on the mantel. And then he set down his coffee cup with the same measured deliberateness he applied to everything. "Sit down," he said. "I'll keep this brief." She sat in the chair across from him, the chair she had eaten 3 meals a day, in for 4 years, the chair that had never felt like hers, in the house that had never felt like hers either. Edwin folded his hands. He had good hands for a man his age, no calluses, no scarring, the hands of someone who had never done physical work and was proud of it. He had been a merchant, then a financier, and then Clara Veyne had come into his orbit, and he had married her quickly and efficiently the way he did everything. Lenora had been 12. She remembered thinking that maybe this was going to be fine. She remembered being wrong. "Your mother passed 11 months ago," Edwin said, as though Lenora might have forgotten. "I honored my obligation to her by keeping you in this house through the remainder of the school term and through this past summer. You turned 18 this morning. My legal responsibility to you is finished." Lenora didn't move. She had known this was coming in the abstract, the way you know winter is coming. You understand it intellectually for months before the cold actually hits your skin. But sitting across from now, watching him speak about her mother's death like it was a line item in a ledger, something came in her chest that she hadn't expected. Not grief, exactly. Not anger yet, either. Something colder and more clarifying than both. She understood, with the sudden completeness of a window coming clean, that Edwin had never thought of her as a person. He had thought of her as a condition of marriage, a complication, a cost he had been running the numbers on for 4 years. "I've prepared 2 things for you," he continued. He reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and removed a slim white envelope. He set it on the table between them and kept his hand flat on top of it for a moment, as though presenting a gift, which was not what he was doing. "That should be more than sufficient to get you established somewhere. You're a capable girl. I'm told you have some woodworking ability from your grandfather." Surely that amounts to something. The way he said it, surely that amounts to something, with that particular species of dismissal that frames contempt as encouragement. Lenora felt it land in her stomach like a stone dropped in cold water. And the second thing she said, her voice came out level. She was surprised. Edwin slid a folded document from beneath the envelope. It was yellowed at the creases, the kind of paper that had been folded and unfolded many times before being forgotten in a drawer. Deed to a property in the mountains above Ironwood Pass. It came as part of your mother's estate, which I've settled. Property has no assessed value on the county rolls. It hasn't been occupied in at least 3 decades. The county tried to auction it twice and had no takers. He paused. I had a surveyor look at it 2 years ago, when I was considering whether it could be sold for timber value. His report was not encouraging. What did it say? He said the cabin was a safety hazard, and the access trail was impassable in winter. Edwin picked up his coffee. He recommended demolition. Lenora looked at the deed. Then she looked at the envelope with $20 in it. Then she looked at Edwin Harrow's face, which was already turning back toward the newspaper, because as far as he was concerned, this conversation was over. This transaction was complete. He had handed her the invoice, and now she could leave, and he could get back to his mourning. Something ignited in her then. It didn't feel noble. It didn't feel like courage. It felt like the particular kind of rage that comes when someone reduces you to arithmetic and expects you to thank them for the math. My mother lived in this house for 4 years, Lenora said. Edwin glanced up from the newspaper. She cooked your meals and managed your household and sat across from you at this table every morning, and she never once. Lenora stopped. She pressed her lips together. She wasn't going to cry. She had decided that, before she came downstairs actually, she had decided that weeks ago in the way you make decisions for emergencies before the emergency arrives. You couldn't even put out a second plate. Edwin considered her with the expression of a man entertaining an interruption he finds mildly tedious. I don't see what that has to do with anything. I know you don't, Lenora said. She picked up the envelope. She picked up the deed. She pushed back the chair and stood, and she walked out of the dining room. And she went upstairs and got her coat, the thin one, the only one she had, and her grandfather Bram's old canvas tool bag, and the wooden bird Bram had carved with her when she was 7, the one she had kept on her windowsill for 11 years, because it was the single most comforting object she owned. She didn't take much else. There wasn't much else that was actually hers. At the front door she paused, not because she was reconsidering, because she was giving herself a moment to understand that the next time she came back through a door, it would be a different door. Her door. Whatever that meant. Whatever she had to do to make it true. The morning air was October cold and smelled like pine sap and coming rain. She had 17 cents in her left pocket and $20 in an envelope and a deed to a ruin in the mountains. And she was 18 years old, and she was alone in a way that felt both terrible and, underneath that, something she couldn't quite name yet. She started walking. Ironwood Pass was a small town in the way that a knot is small, dense, tight, everything tangled up with everything else. About 400 people, maybe a few dozen more, in the outlying homesteads and ranches that fed into it. One main street, a handful of cross streets, a church, a school, Mercer's Frontier Supply, which was the largest building in town, and the place where most important decisions happened, whether Amos Mercer was involved in them or not. The kind of town where everybody had an opinion about you before you'd said a word, because they'd already formed one about your parents. Lenora had grown up on the edge of this town, not quite in it. Edwin's house was positioned at enough of a remove that they weren't really neighbors with anyone, and Edwin had never been the type to encourage neighborliness. Clara had tried quietly in the early years, but Edwin had discouraged it with such consistent politeness that she'd eventually stopped. So Lenora knew people's faces better than their names, and they knew her as Harrow's stepdaughter, which was not the same as knowing her. She stopped at the general store to get a few things with a portion of the $20. Cornmeal, dried beans, a small sack of salt pork, a box of matches. She stood at the counter and calculated in her head, the way Bram had taught her, because Bram had always said that a woman who couldn't keep her own accounts was a woman who would always need someone else to keep them for her. The woman behind the counter was maybe 50, with a permanent crease between her eyebrows that suggested She had spent decades worrying about something. She watched Lenora count out the coins with an expression that wasn't unkind exactly, but wasn't comfortable either. "You're the Harrow girl," she said. "Not a question." "I'm Lenora Veyne," Lenora said. "My mother was Clara Veyne before she remarried." The woman nodded slowly. "Heard Edwin was putting you out. Small towns." Of course she'd heard. "I'm going up to the property on the mountain," Lenora said. "The old one off the high trail." The woman's expression shifted. The crease between her eyebrows deepened. "That place." She shook her head. "Honey, I don't know who told you that property was worth going to, but they did you no favors. That cabin has been falling down since before you were born. Harshest winters on this whole range come off that ridge. People have tried to camp there before miners, mostly, and none of them stayed past the first real storm. My grandfather was Bram Veyne," Lenora said. The woman paused. "Carpenter? He taught me to look at the bones of a structure," Lenora said, "not the surface." A silence. The crease between the woman's eyebrows didn't go away, but something in her face shifted, not convinced, but at least willing to let the conversation be over. She wrapped Lenora's goods in brown paper and tied them with string. "You need rope?" she asked. "I'll throw in 20 feet of rope. No charge." She said it the way women of a certain age give advice, not as charity, but as something practical from someone who has watched enough situations go badly to know which equipment changes the outcome. "Yes," Lenora said. "Thank you." Outside, she adjusted the tool bag on her shoulder and balanced the wrapped goods against her hip. The mountain rose in the north above the tree line. She could see the ridge from the main street, and somewhere on that ridge, invisible from here, was a cabin that hadn't been lived in for 30 years, that a county assessor had declared worthless, that a surveyor had recommended demolishing. She started walking toward it. The trail took 4 hours. She had the deed with the surveyor's rough map. Sketched in the margin, she'd looked at it in the store, while the woman was wrapping her goods, memorizing the landmarks. A split boulder at the first switchback, a dry creek crossing, a stand of dead larch. The trail itself was overgrown, but still traceable, the kind of trail made by repeated use and then abandoned slowly as the use stopped, not by any single decision, but by accumulated avoidance. By the second hour, her legs were burning. By the third, her right shoulder had gone mostly numb under the weight of the tool bag. She stopped twice, once to drink from a stream she crossed, and once because she turned her ankle slightly on a loose rock and needed a moment to determine if it was actually serious or just painful. It was just painful. She kept walking. When she finally saw the cabin, she stopped. Not because it was worse than she had expected bad, but because seeing something you've been preparing yourself for in the abstract is still different from standing in front of it. The roof had partially collapsed on the left side, beams showing through like broken ribs. One window had a piece of torn canvas nailed over it, the other was simply open to the air. The front door hung by one hinge, cocked at an angle, and the boards of the porch had mostly rotted through. From a distance in the failing afternoon light, it looked exactly like what Edwin had called it, a worthless ruin. Lenora set down her goods in her tool bag. She rolled her sore shoulder twice. Then she walked to the front wall of the cabin and pressed her palm flat against one of the corner logs. Her grandfather's voice, clear as if he were standing beside her, "Don't look at what's broken. Look at what's holding." She walked the perimeter slowly. She pushed against each corner. She tested the foundation stones with her boot, rocking her weight onto them one by one. She crouched at the base of the wall and looked at the joinery where the corner logs met old-growth timber, hand-fit, the kind of work that took a craftsman weeks. She looked at the sill logs closest to the ground and found, yes, some rot, but contained surface rot on wood that had been heartwood when it was cut, probably 50 or 60 years ago or more, dense-grained and slow to decay. She found the hearth through the crooked front door. Most of the cabin's interior was salvageable. She could see that even in the dimming light. Debris, yes. Damage, yes. But the main walls were solid. The stone foundation was true. She built a small fire in the remains of the hearth, that evening small, because the chimney needed inspection, before she trusted it with a real fire, and she ate cold beans from the pot, and sat on the floor with her back against the wall that held the hearth, and she thought about her mother, and she thought about Bram, and she thought about Edwin's hands folded on the table with such deliberate composure. Surely that amounts to something. She looked at her own hands in the firelight. They were already rough from years of working with wood, from learning at Bram's side, from the time she was 7, not because she'd been pushed into it, but because of the only place she'd ever felt completely competent, completely herself. The workshop had been the one room in her world where the rules made sense to her, where effort produced measurable results, where the wood either held or it didn't, and you could see why. She turned her hands over. They were calloused and capable, and they were all she had. She decided that was enough. She didn't sleep well. The wind found every gap in the walls, and there were many. She woke twice to the sound of something moving in the dark outside animals, probably drawn by the smells of salt pork, and lay still listening until the sound stopped. At first light, she was already on her feet. The first thing she did was go back to the hearth. She crouched. Its windows were dark. She crouched in front of it with a stub of candle she'd brought and worked her hand into the firebox, feeling along the stonework for the condition of the mortar, checking the draw of the chimney by holding the candle flame up and watching how it moved. And then her boot came down on the hearthstone. The large central stone, maybe 2 feet across, fitted granite, smoothed on its top face, rocked under her weight. Not much, not dramatically, but it moved. Lenora went very still. A rocking hearthstone could mean a dozen things: subsidence, a shifted foundation below, an improperly seated stone that had been moving for decades and would move for decades more. She shifted her weight back and forth, slow and deliberate, and watched the movement. Then she thought about what her grandfather had said about the heart of a house. Bram had been almost reverential about it: the hearth, the center, the place where the household lived. If the heart is rotten, he'd said once, the rest is just a pretty shell. She got down on her knees. She pressed her fingers along the edges of the stone. Then she felt something that didn't belong: a small, deliberate gap on the far side, not the erosion gap of settling stone, but a gap that ran in a straight line, as though the stone had been cut with a specific edge to fit a specific space and designed to be lifted. Her heartbeat changed. She tried to clear her head. Don't make more of this than it is, she told herself. It's probably just uneven setting. She went to the tool bag and got the pry bar. She worked it into the gap carefully, the way Bram had taught her to do everything, not with force, but with patience, finding where the resistance was and working with the geometry of the thing rather than against it. The stone shifted. Then it lifted. Beneath it was a shallow void in the foundation, lined with flat stones on all 4 sides. And inside the void, wrapped in oilskin tied with a leather cord, was something that had been waiting there for a very long time. Lenora sat back on her heels. Outside, the wind came off the mountain and pushed against the walls. She could hear, in the silence between wind gusts, her own breathing. She reached into the void and lifted the bundle out. The oilskin was stiff with age. The leather cord knotted so many times it had fused into something closer to a single knot than several. Lenora worked at it with her thumbnail for a full minute before giving up and cutting it with the small folding knife she kept in the tool bag. Her hands were not entirely steady. She noticed that and didn't particularly judge herself for it. She unwrapped the oilskin on the floor beside the hearth, peeling back the layers slowly, the way you'd unwrap something you suspect might be fragile, even though she had no idea yet what she was dealing with. The oilskin had done its job. Whatever was inside had been protected from the damp, from the cold, from 3 decades of mountain winters pressing down on the stone above it. The first thing that emerged was a tin box, rectangular, the kind used for storing tobacco or small tools, sealed around the lid with a second layer of waxed cloth pressed tight. Then a leather journal, the cover worn smooth and dark from handling, a faded brown that might once have been richer. And beneath the journal, folded in thirds, a letter on paper so old it had gone the color of weak tea. Lenora sat cross-legged on the floor and set all 3 objects in front of her. She looked at them for a moment without touching anything. Then she opened the tin box. She counted the coins twice because she didn't trust herself the first time. 30 $20 gold coins. $600. She sat with the tin balanced on her knee and stared at the coins for long enough that the candle burned down another 1/4 inch. The number didn't become more real with staring. $600 was more money than she had ever seen in one place. It was more money than Edwin had given Clara for household expenses in an entire year. It was she stopped trying to frame it in comparisons and simply let it sit there, a fact cold and gold and impossible, in a tin box under a hearthstone in a mountain cabin that everyone had told her was worthless. She picked up the letter. The handwriting was small and precise, the handwriting of someone who had been taught to write carefully and had never stopped. The ink had faded to brown at the edges of each stroke, but the center lines were still readable. She held it close to the candle. To whoever stands in this cabin with the patience to restore it. My name is Adelaide Fenwick. I was a school teacher. I came to this mountain 23 years ago with my husband, Thomas, who believed the high country held opportunities that the lowlands did not. Thomas died in the third winter. I stayed because I had nowhere better to go, and because I had come to love the mountain in the way you love difficult things, not despite the difficulty, but partly because of it. I have no family. I have no one to leave what I've saved. I could leave it to the church or the county and watch it disappear into some institution's account, or I could leave it here, in this house, in trust for the person who proved they valued what I valued, the willingness to look at something broken and see what it could become. If you have found this box, you have already demonstrated that you possess more perception than most. The hearthstone was the heart of this house. I chose it deliberately. Anyone can look at a cabin and see the roof. Not everyone stops to check the foundation. The money is yours. All of it. Spend it however your judgment tells you. There is one thing I ask, not as a condition, but as a hope, that someday, when you are able, you might do the same for someone else. Not necessarily money. Sometimes it is only a door left open. Sometimes it is only the decision to say yes, this person is worth something, when the rest of the world has decided otherwise. The journal contains what I learned about this mountain in 23 years of living on it. I hope it serves you as well as it served me. Adelaide Fenwick. Lenora read the letter twice. Then she sat with it in her hands for a while without reading it again. Outside, the wind had picked up. She could hear it in the chimney, a low moan that rose and fell, and she could hear it finding the gaps in the wallboards and the edges of the canvas-covered window. Candle flame shivered. She cupped her hand around it automatically, a reflex, the way you protect small things without thinking about it. She was not a person who cried easily. Bram had always said she processed things slowly, that she was the kind of person who felt everything eventually, but took the long route. Sitting on the floor of this wreck of a cabin in the early morning of October, 18 years old, with a letter from a dead woman in her hands and 30 gold coins in a tobacco tin beside her knee, she didn't cry. But something shifted in her chest, something that had been braced tight for a long time, and the release of it felt like the first exhale after holding your breath underwater. Adelaide Fenwick had been alone on this mountain. Adelaide Fenwick had built a life here that was worthy of the name. And Adelaide Fenwick, who had never met Lenora Veyne and never would, had chosen to believe that the right person would come, had bet her life savings on it. Lenora folded the letter carefully along its original creases and set it on top of the journal. Then she picked up the tin box, carried it to the corner of the cabin where the foundation was most solid and set it down. She took out 12 of the coins and put them in the inside pocket of her coat, buttoned the pocket shut. The rest she rewrapped in the oilskin, not the way she'd found it, because that knot was gone, but carefully, thoroughly, the way Bram had taught her to wrap tools against the damp. She set the wrapped bundle back in the void beneath the hearthstone and lowered the stone back into place. She stood up and tested it with her boot. It held. She would deal with that seating problem later. She would remortar the edges and set it properly, and it would never rock again. But for now it held, and that was enough for now. She opened the journal. Adelaide Fenwick had been a thorough and unsentimental woman. The journal was not a diary in the emotional sense. It was almost entirely practical. Where to find the spring that ran year-round on the east face of the ridge, even in January? Which wood burned longest through the night? Which burned hottest? Where the deer ran in October? Where they sheltered in February? What plants were edible? Which months prepared how? Where to set a snare for rabbit? The distance to the nearest working trail in each direction, and which way the storms typically came from. How to read the clouds above the northern peak for advance warning of a 3-day blow. Page after page of it. 23 years of hard knowledge, written in that small, precise hand, organized by season. Lenora read for 2 hours. Seated on the floor, with the journal balanced on her knee, occasionally turning back to reread something, occasionally getting up to cross the cabin and look at something from the window, the angle of the terrain, a tree formation Adelaide had described as a landmark, and then returning to the journal. By the time she set it down, the light through the canvas-covered window had changed from pale gray to something warmer and more definite. Morning properly arrived. She had been awake for 6 hours. She had 12 gold coins in her coat pocket, a dead woman's accumulated knowledge of this mountain, and a cabin that needed approximately everything done to it. She was also hungry in a way that reminded her she'd only eaten cold beans the night before, and nothing since. She made a small fire carefully, watching the chimney draw, ready to damp it down if anything went wrong, and cooked cornmeal in the pan she'd brought. It wasn't good exactly, just cornmeal and salt and a little of the salt pork rendered down for fat. But she ate all of it and cleaned the pan with a handful of dry grass, the way Bram had shown her for field work. Then she started making the real list. Not in her head. On paper, the back pages of a small notebook she kept in the tool bag for measurements and calculations. She walked every inch of the cabin touching, pressing, testing, calculating, and she wrote down what she found. Roof, left side collapsed approximately 8 feet, remaining structure sound, but needs inspection before loading new shakes on it. Windows 2, both compromised, need glass or at minimum heavy oilcloth. Door, rehang on new hardware. 1 hinge, salvageable. 1 needs replacement. Floor 7 boards rotted through near the window side, rest solid. Walls, exterior needs recalking along the north face. Interior has sections of chinking knocked out, several places. Hearth, functional pending mortar repair on the central stone seating. Chimney, draws adequately but needs cleaning before heavy use. She stood in the middle of the cabin and looked at the list. It was a lot. It was genuinely a lot, and she understood that clearly, without softening it. She was one person, 18 years old, with basic tools and a limited supply budget, and the first serious mountain winter, approaching sometime in the next 4 to 6 weeks, maybe sooner if the northern peaks were any indication. She was not afraid. She noticed that. She was concerned in the practical sense of someone who has assessed a real problem and understood its dimensions. But the particular fear that had been sitting in her chest since October began the formless dread of having nowhere, of being no one's responsibility, of being released into the world like something that had been dropped. That fear was quieter now, because she had a problem with specific dimensions. And specific problems, Bram had taught her, can be addressed specifically. She folded the list and put it in her coat pocket next to the coins. She picked up her tools. She started on the roof. The first week was the worst week she would ever have on that mountain, and she would have many bad weeks before winter broke. The partial roof collapse on the left side meant she was working elevated on the exterior of a building machine tret she was still assessing as she went, with October wind coming off the ridge in gusts that occasionally made her grab the nearest solid timber and hold on. She found 2 more compromised rafters that hadn't been visible from below, and replacing them required rigging a system of rope, loops, and counterweights that took her half a day to figure out and left her hands raw from the friction even through her work gloves. She cut lodgepole pine from the nearest stand on the property. Adelaide's journal had mapped it, a good-sized grove a quarter-mile north, the logs straight and dense-grained, excellent for shakes when split along the grain. She didn't have a proper froe for splitting shakes, so she improvised with a chisel and mallet. The way you improvise when necessity has already won the argument about proper equipment. Her shoulders gave her trouble from the 3rd day on. The left one particularly, an old issue from a fall she'd taken in Bram's workshop at 14, landing wrong, something that had never quite healed correctly and announced its displeasure when overworked. She wrapped it each morning with a strip of cloth torn from an extra shirt and worked through it because there was no alternative that didn't involve stopping. And stopping meant the roof stayed open. She fell off the roof on day 5. Not far 8 feet from the lower section she'd been working on, and she caught herself on the way down, grabbed the wall log that jutted out at the corner, and got one hand around it, which turned an 8-foot fall into a 4-foot drop onto the soft ground at the cabin's base. She lay on her back for a moment looking up at the sky, which was the flat white of clouds building toward something serious, and she took an inventory of herself the way Bram had taught her: head, neck, shoulders, hands, down through everything, checking for the particular feeling of something genuinely wrong versus something that just hurt. Her right hip had hit first. It would bruise badly. Her hand, the one that had caught the log, had taken bark off 2 knuckles. Nothing was broken. She'd bitten the inside of her cheek and could taste blood. She got up. She climbed back up. On day 7, she finished the roof and stood on the ground beside the cabin and looked up at it in the late afternoon light. It wasn't beautiful. The new shakes were lighter than the surrounding weathered ones and would look patched for years until the elements evened them out. The lines of its windows were dark. The lines weren't perfectly true because she'd had to work around the existing structure rather than rebuilding from scratch. But it was sound. She walked around the perimeter in the coming dark and looked up from every angle and couldn't find a gap. She pressed her palm against the wall at the corner. "That's one," she said aloud. Her voice sounded strange in the quiet, a little hoarse from days of not talking to anyone. She cleared her throat and didn't say anything else. The supply problem was becoming real. She had rationed carefully, but by the end of the first week, she was down to the last of the cornmeal and half the beans, and the salt pork was gone. She had coins in her coat pocket, which meant nothing until she got back to Ironwood Pass to spend them. And Ironwood Pass was 4 hours, each way on a trail that was getting harder to read as the season turned. She debated it for a day and a half, running the numbers, what she could still stretch, how long that would last, whether the roof could have waited while she made a supply run first. The answer kept coming back the same. She'd made the right call on the roof. The roof had to come first because a bad storm with an open roof would have ended the whole project and possibly ended her. But now she needed to go to town. She wrapped the 12 coins in a handkerchief, deep in her coat pocket, buttoned and pinned. She took the tool bag for the tools. She still needed nails. Particularly, she was almost out of nails, and she needed proper window glass and a length of stovepipe if there was any hope of installing a stove before the first serious freeze. She walked down the mountain in the early morning, a full 4 hours, and arrived at the edge of Ironwood Pass at midday with sore legs and a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from doing hard physical work for 7 days, without adequate food and with insufficient sleep. The town was doing what small towns do at midday, a moderate level of activity: horses at the hitching posts, a few people on the main street, smoke from the chimneys of the buildings that had occupants who were inside. She was aware of a few glances as she walked towards Mercer's Frontier Supply. She was aware that she probably looked like someone who had been living rough, because she had been living rough, and that in a small town this was information people would immediately begin processing and sharing. She pushed open the door of Mercer's. The inside of the store smelled like leather and sawdust and lamp oil, a smell she had always found genuinely comforting, one of those smells that attached itself to memories of Bram's workshop and stayed there. 2 men were at the counter ahead of her, a rancher she vaguely recognized, and someone she didn't know. She waited. Amos Mercer was a large man, wide through the shoulders, with the kind of face that settled naturally into skepticism the way some faces settle naturally into welcome. He'd been running the store for 20-something years and had developed the merchant's habit of sizing up customers before they opened their mouth, not unkindly, but efficiently. He looked at Lenora now with that assessment happening visibly behind his eyes. "Help you?" he said when the rancher and the stranger had taken their goods and left. "I have a list," Lenora said. She put it on the counter. Mercer read it. His eyebrows moved once, a slight elevation, and then settled back. He looked up from the list at Lenora, back at the list. "This for the old Fenwick property," he said. "Up on the ridge?" "It's my property," Lenora said. "Yes. I know whose it is," Mercer said, and something in his tone wasn't hostile exactly, but it wasn't warm either. "Word got around that Edwin Harrow handed it to you." A pause. "Along with some other things that got around." She didn't respond to that. She waited. Mercer set the list on the counter. "Window glass, I've got standard panes, 4 sizes. The 12x16 will be your best option for Frontier sash. Stovepipe." He turned and looked at the shelving behind him, more for form than necessity, the way a man looks who already knows his inventory. "I've got 6-inch diameter, 8-foot sections with the elbow fittings. You're looking at the whole assembly for one stove installation." He set his hands on the counter and leveled a look at her. Are you aware of what this list is going to total? I've been calculating since I wrote it, Lenora said. I'm expecting somewhere around $4.70, depending on your current nail price. Something shifted in Mercer's face. A slight adjustment. $4.85, he said. Nails went up. Wire shipment got delayed. $4.85, Lenora said. She reached into her coat pocket, unwrapped the handkerchief on the counter, and placed a $20 gold coin between them. The store was not silent. There were two other people further back in the shelves, but the sound changed. Mercer looked at the coin. He looked at Lenora. He picked up the coin and turned it over once, the way a man does when he's verifying rather than doubting, because Mercer had seen enough currency in 20 years of frontier commerce to know the real thing immediately, and this was the real thing. He set it back down. Where'd this come from? He said. Came to me honestly, Lenora said. That's not what I asked. It's the answer I have. She met his eyes without looking away. I'm not going to explain myself beyond that, Mr. Mercer. You can accept the payment or you can decline it. Those are your options. Pause. Not a comfortable pause. Mercer was a man who had opinions about the right order of things, and a penniless girl arriving from an abandoned mountain property with a gold coin after being put out by her stepfather 1 week ago did not fit neatly into any order he recognized. But a gold coin was a gold coin, and Amos Mercer had not stayed in business for 23 years by refusing legal tender. I'll need to make change, he said. I know, Lenora said. He filled the order himself, moving through the store with the deliberateness of a man who was also thinking, pulling items from shelves and stacking them on the counter. The window glass he wrapped in straw and burlap, 3 panes of it. The nails he weighed into a paper sack on the scale. The stovepipe sections he brought from the back, one at a time, 4 sections with an elbow fitting and a roof collar. 2 more items on the list. He was briefly out of a draw knife and a proper froe, and he wrote them down and told her he'd have them in 2 weeks. By the time everything was stacked on the counter, Lenora had a separate problem. She could carry the tools and the nails and most of the smaller items. She could not carry 4 stovepipe sections, 3 panes of window glass, and 50 pounds of provisions 4 hours up a mountain trail. She had not worked this part of the problem all the way through, she realized. She'd been focused on having the money and the list, and the nerve to come in and make the purchase. She had not thought clearly enough about the logistics of what happened after. Mercer was watching her look at the pile. You planning on hauling that up the ridge yourself? He said. I'm working on the problem, Lenora said, which was honest. Mercer made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Not dismissive, more like the sound of a man recognizing a situation he's seen before. You know Orson Pike? I know who he is, Lenora said. Orson Pike was the blacksmith. She'd seen him at the hardware end of the main street. A large man with a gray-streaked beard who moved with the deliberate economy of someone for whom most physical tasks in the world were simply a matter of application. He's got a mule, Mercer said. He hauls freight up to the old McCallum homestead twice a month for the family up there. I know he's making a run day after tomorrow. The Ridge Trail passes within half a mile of the Fenwick property, your property. He might. Mercer stopped and seemed to decide something. He's a fair man. Explain your situation plainly, and he won't make you feel bad about asking. Lenora looked at Mercer. She wasn't entirely sure what to make of this. The way you're never entirely sure. When someone does something unexpectedly decent, whether to trust it. But Mercer had already turned back to the counter and was counting out her change with the same businesslike attention he applied to everything. $15.15, he said, and put it in a small cloth drawstring bag. Lenora put the bag in her coat pocket. She looked at the pile of supplies on the counter. I'll speak to Mr. Pike, she said. He'll be at the smithy, Mercer said. He was already moving on to other things. But when Lenora was almost to the door, he spoke again without looking up. The glass panes will be fine here until you're ready to move them. I'll put them in the back. She stopped. Thank you, she said. He didn't respond, but he didn't have to. Orson Pike was working when she arrived at the smithy, something involving a wheel rim, a fire going in the forge, the rhythmic ring of hammer on metal that she'd always found oddly soothing, the same quality of repetitive, precise work that she found soothing in her own hands. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, she thought, thick through the arms and chest, with the permanent squint of someone who spent long hours working near bright heat. He looked at her when she came through the open door, didn't stop hammering immediately, finished the stroke he was on, and then set the hammer down on the anvil and turned. "Pike," she said. "That's right." He picked up a rag and wiped his hands with it, in a way that was mostly habit. "You're the Harrow girl." He said it the same way the woman at the general store had, and the same way Mercer had, and she was already understanding that this was going to be the defining phrase of her existence in this town for some time to come, and that the only useful response to it was to keep correcting it until it stopped being true of how people thought of her. "Lenora Veyne," she said. "I own the old Fenwick property on the upper ridge. I have supplies I need hauled up. Mercer told me you make runs past that trailhead twice a month." Pike looked at her steadily. He wasn't sizing her up the way Mercer had. There was less calculation in it and more simple attention. The looks of someone who takes things at face value until given a reason not to. "I do," he said. "Day after tomorrow, early start." "I can pay you for the trouble," Lenora said. $1 for the extra weight and the detour." Pike was quiet for a moment. "That property's been standing empty since before I came to this valley," he said. "You planning to live up there?" "Winter's coming." "I'm aware," Lenora said. "It's not a thing people say as a pleasantry up here," Pike said. It wasn't unkind, but it was direct. "That ridge gets weather that makes the valley floor look like spring. Last winter we had 6 weeks where you couldn't have got down that trail on a bet." "I've been up there for a week," Lenora said. "I finished the roof 2 days ago." Something changed in Pike's face. It was subtle, a slight realignment of the features, the look of a man who is updating an assessment he'd made quickly and is finding the update interesting. "You fixed that roof yourself?" "I did. On that structure." "It needed doing," Lenora said. "It's done." Pike looked at her for another moment. Then he picked up his hammer again, turned back to the forge, and checked the rim with a set of tongs. "Day after tomorrow," he said. "First light. Have your goods at the north end of the main street. I'll put the glass on last so it doesn't shift." "Thank you," Lenora said. "Don't thank me," Pike said. $1's a dollar. But the way he said it was not unfriendly, and she understood, in the way you understand things that are communicated in the space between the words, that Orson Pike was a man who respected a person getting on with things. She had already gotten on with things. She intended to keep doing so. She spent that night at the edge of town, in the lean-to shelter behind the livery stable, where the liveryman, a quiet older man named Foss, let travelers sleep for a dime if they were decent about it and left no mess. She'd asked, and he'd said yes without making her explain anything, which she was grateful for. She lay on her back on her bedroll on the stable floor, with Bram's wooden bird in her left hand and Adelaide's journal on her chest, and she thought, not about the future in any grand sense, but about the specific problems waiting for her tomorrow and the day after. The window installation, the door hardware, the chinking on the north wall. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees. The stove she'd need to cut a hole in the roof for the stovepipe, and she was doing that work in her mind already, calculating the angle of the collar, the distance from the nearest combustible material, the way the pipe sections would connect. She did not think about Edwin. She noticed that deliberately, the way you notice the absence of something painful. She had thought about him for years, in the automatic way you think about someone whose approval you have wanted and not received, turning the problem of his disapproval over and over, looking for the angle that would resolve it. She understood now, finally and completely, that there was no such angle. The problem was not solvable because it was not actually her problem. It had always been his. She put the wooden bird in her coat pocket and closed her eyes. Outside, a horse shifted in its stall. The wind moved through the gaps in the stable walls. Somewhere down the main street, a door opened and closed. She slept. The morning of the supply run, Pike arrived at the north end of the street with a mule of considerable size and apparent ill temper, a gray animal with a white blaze and the look of something that had long since made peace with a lifetime of heavy work and expected everyone around it to do the same. Pike loaded with the efficiency of a man who had done it hundreds of times goods. Balanced precisely, the glass panes padded in straw and loaded flat across the top of the pack, roped down in a pattern that distributed weight evenly and allowed for the sway of mountain trail movement. He didn't talk much on the trail. She didn't either. They stopped once at the dry creek crossing to let the mule drink from a pool that had collected against a rock, and Pike produced 2 pieces of hardtack from his coat pocket and offered her one without comment. Took it. They ate in silence, looking up the trail. "How long have you been the smith here?" Lenora asked. 11 years, Pike said. "You come from somewhere else before?" "Colorado Territory," he said. "Didn't suit me." She accepted this. "Adelaide Fenwick, did you know her?" Pike was quiet for a moment. "She'd been gone 10 years before I came. But I heard about her. They still talk about her at the schoolhouse she taught there for a few winters before she went back up to the mountain permanently." He looked up the trail. People thought she was peculiar. Woman living alone up there by choice. Was she? Lenora said. Peculiar? Pike considered it with the seriousness of a man who doesn't use words loosely. Or write about something the rest of them weren't. He picked up the mule's lead. Depends who you ask. When they reached the half-mile mark from the cabin, Pike helped her unload with the same wordless efficiency. She made 3 trips with the heavier items while he held the mule, and then he came himself with the glass panes, carrying them with an unexpected delicacy, the big hands cradling the burlap-wrapped packages with a care she wouldn't have predicted from his size. At the cabin, he set the glass down and looked at the structure for a long moment. He walked to the nearest corner and pressed on it the same instinctive assessment she'd made herself a week ago. He looked up at the roof, her roof, the new shakes pale against the weathered gray. He said. "What?" Lenora said. "Nothing bad," Pike said. He looked at the cabin a moment more. "You've got a good pitch on those new shakes. Water will run clean." He turned and looked at her. "That the hearth smoke?" He was looking at the small stream of white rising from the chimney she'd left a small fire burning, damped down, to keep the interior from going to freezing. "Yes," Lenora said. "Chimney draws well." "It does now," she said. "It needed cleaning." He nodded once. The way a person nods when what they've been told confirms what they suspected. "You're going to need help with the stovepipe collar," he said. "Cutting through an existing roof without cracking the surrounding shakes, it's a 2-person job." She looked at him. "I'm back through this trail in 2 weeks, Pike said. "I'll bring the tools for the collar cut if you want." It was offered the same way he'd offered the hardtack on the trail, not as generosity exactly, not as something requiring gratitude, but as a practical assessment delivered straightforwardly by someone who saw a problem and had the means to address it, and found it reasonable to say so. "Yes," Lenora said, "thank you. I'll also bring the draw knife and fro Mercer's got coming," he said. "Save you the trip down." He gathered his lead rope and gave the mule a businesslike pat on the neck that the mule accepted with insulted dignity. He started back down the trail. "Pike," Lenora said. He turned. "Why are you helping me?" It wasn't a suspicious question. It was a genuine one. She had learned enough about small towns up in Asatweek to know that charity came with narratives attached, and she needed to understand what narrative she was being placed in. Pike looked at her with that same steady, measuring attention. "I'm not helping you," he said. "I'm doing work I'm being paid for, and I'm telling you how to not crack your roof shakes when you cut the stovepipe collar." He paused. "You did a good job on that roof," he added, and something in the way he said it made it clear. This was not encouragement for encouragement's sake. It was a professional observation from a man who knew enough about construction to know what he was looking at. He turned back down the trail. The mule picked its way carefully over the loose stone, making no concessions to anyone's idea of elegance. Lenora watched them until the trees took them, and then she picked up the first of the stovepipe sections and carried it inside. The next 10 days moved in the way that hard, sustained work moves long and grinding within each individual day, but compressed in retrospect because the mind stores labor differently than it stores event. She installed the window glass herself, cutting the existing rough frames to accept the standard panes, setting each one in oil-glazed putty that she made from linseed oil and chalk dust from the cabin's old fireplace ash. It wasn't a perfect glazing compound. It cracked in 2 places when it dried, and she had to work it again. But the glass held, and the first morning she woke up to a cabin with actual windows, light coming through cleanly instead of being blocked by canvas. She sat on the floor in the beam of early sun for 3 full minutes, doing nothing but existing in it. The door she rebuilt from scratch. The hinges she had, the hardware was workable, but the door itself had warped too badly to rehang. It would never close square. She split new boards from the lodgepole pine, fit them on the tongue-and-groove pattern Bram had taught her for door construction, and hung the new door in a single day. It swung true on the first test and latched solid. She opened it and closed it 6 times, not to check, but because the feeling of it, the solid click of a well-fitted door meeting its frame, was one of the most satisfying sounds she had ever heard. She recaulked the north wall, mixing clay from the creek bank with dry grass fibers, and working it into the gaps between the logs with her hands, pressing and smoothing ceilings the wall against the wind that came down off the northern peak and found every opening like something with an agenda. Her hands were a constant condition of soreness by this point, blisters over blisters. The skin of her palms hardened in layers, knuckles cracked from the cold. She rubbed them each night with a small amount of the lard she'd bought for cooking, working it in before sleep. It helped a little, and Adelaide's journal was with her constantly, the way a good reference stays with you, not always open, but always near. She'd read sections in the evening, planning the next day, cross-referencing what Adelaide had said about the North Vatorf wall's particular vulnerability to drift with what she was experiencing as she worked it. Adelaide had been right about everything she'd tested so far. The spring on the east face was exactly where she'd marked it. The deer trail she'd described along the lower ridge ran exactly where Adelaide said it ran. The woman had paid attention to her mountain with the full dedication of someone who had nothing else to attend to, and that attention had become knowledge. And that knowledge had become this journal, and now that knowledge was Lenora's. She thought about that sometimes in the evenings. One woman's 23 years of solitary experience transferred to another woman she'd never met through the medium of a journal and an act of deliberate trust. It felt, in a way she couldn't have fully articulated, like the most complete form of inheritance she had ever encountered. When Pike came back 2 weeks later with the draw knife, the froe, and the collar tool for the stovepipe cut, he found the windows installed, the door rehung, the north wall sealed, and Lenora standing on the roof marking the collar position with chalk while the mule watched from below with its customary expression of universal disapproval. He tied the mule to the nearest tree and looked up at her. "You didn't wait," he said. "I waited on the collar," she said. "Everything else was solvable." He climbed up without being asked, and they cut the collar opening together. He was right. It was a 2-person job, one to work the cutter and one to hold the surrounding shakes from stress cracking along the saw line. Pipe sections went in section by section, the elbow fitting connecting the vertical run to the horizontal through the wall. The collar flashed with sheet tin he'd brought and sealed with a fire clay compound he'd mixed and carried in a tin pail. When they tested it stove cold, just drawing air through the system, the draw was strong and clean. Lenora climbed down and looked at the stovepipe rising from the roof. "One more thing I need to solve," she said. "What's that?" "Stove," she said. She looked at him. "I have enough left to buy one, but the transport." "McCallum family ordered a cast-iron range last season," Pike said. "They went back east for the winter. It's sitting in my smithy in the crate." He paused, with the particular pause of a man building to a practical proposition. "They won't be back till spring. I could bring it up, charge you the same as I charge them for storage, and they collect from me when they return. If you want it for the winter." He looked at her steadily. $3 storage fee. You'd owe me the 3. We'd work out the accounting when McCallum gets back. Lenora looked at him for a moment. "You trust me for it?" she said. "You fixed that roof," Pike said, "and you waited on the collar." She thought about what that meant, what he was actually saying, which was she had demonstrated 2 things, and competence and the judgment to know the edge of her own competence. Those were, in a man like Orson Pike's accounting, something close to character references. "Yes," she said. "I'll take the stove." It took them 4 hours to get it up the trail, the mule expressing its opinion of cast-iron ranges at considerable volume for the first mile. But by evening, the stove was seated on its floor pad inside the cabin, the pipe sections connected. The damper set, and Lenora had a real fire burning, for the first time not the small, careful test fires of the past weeks, but a proper evening fire, the kind that makes a room into a room. Pike stood at the door with his coat back on, ready to head down before dark, and looked at the interior of the cabin, at the windows with real glass, the new door plumb in its frame, swept floor with the new boards she'd fitted, the stove burning, the shelves she'd put up along the east wall, rough but solid, holding her supplies in rows. He looked at it all for a long moment. Adelaide Fenwick built something up here, he said. It wasn't quite addressed to Lenora. It was more like a thought that had arrived and needed saying. Took her 20 years to get the town to take her seriously. He picked up the mule's lead. You're moving faster than she did. He went down the trail. The darkness came in around the trees on the ridge, and inside the cabin, the stove ticked and settled and threw heat into the corners, and Lenora sat at the rough table she'd built from split pine and open Adelaide's journal to the winter section and began to read. Outside, the first real cold of the season moved down off the peak and settled around the cabin like something making a claim. Inside, the fire held. The cold came in stages, the way it always does in the high country, not as a single event but as a series of surrenders, each one harder than the last. First, the nights, which had already been cold, became the kind of cold that got inside your clothes and stayed there. The temperature morning stopped recovering. The temperature at midday began to feel like what the temperature at dawn had felt like 2 weeks prior. Creek on the east face slowed to a trickle, and then froze in sections, leaving only the deep center current moving beneath a skin of gray ice. Lenora tracked all of it in the margins of Adelaide's journal, adding her own observations beside Adelaide's in a different ink, a conversation across decades with a woman she would never meet. Adelaide notes first ice at Creek Crossing October 28. My observation, October 21, 7 days earlier this year. North wind stronger. She didn't know what to make of the discrepancy. Maybe the seasons ran different cycles. Maybe the mountain itself was changing in ways nobody had measured. She wrote it down because Bram had always said that the first rule of working in the physical world was to record what you actually observed rather than what you expected to observe, and the gap between those two things was almost always where the important information lived. The cabin held the heat from the McCallum stove better than she had dared to expect. She'd spent 3 evenings doing nothing, but tracking the thermal performance, feeling the walls at different heights for cold infiltration, watching the candle flame near the window edges for drafts, mapping where the floor was coldest and where the warmth pooled. She found 2 places she'd missed in the chinking, one high on the north wall near the rafter line, and one in the corner behind the stove where the logs had checked along the grain and opened a crack no wider than a finger, but cold enough to matter. Packed both with additional clay mixture she'd kept in reserve, pressing it in with a wooden peg in the gap and letting the stove's heat dry it solid overnight. She was getting better at knowing what she didn't know. That was its own kind of progress. The foods and situation required more active management than the structural work had. Adelaide's journal was clear about winter provisioning. The trail became genuinely impassable for weeks at a time, and the margin for error was absolute zero. Assume 6 weeks of isolation, Adelaide had written. Then add 2 weeks. Whatever you've calculated you need, add 20%. The mountain does not negotiate. Lenora had read that passage 3 times in the early days and thought she understood it. She understood it better now that she was watching the trailhead disappear under accumulated frost, and the gaps between usable travel days shrink from every other day to twice a week, to, increasingly, never. She went down to town one more time in mid-November, her last planned supply run, before she committed to the mountain for the duration. Trail was bad, not impassable yet, but the footing was loose and frost-slicked in the shaded sections, and she made the 4 hours in nearly 5, moving more carefully than she had in October, testing each step in the rocky sections with the walking staff she'd cut from a straight birch limb. Mercer's was busy. When she arrived, 2 ranch families doing their own late-season provisioning, a group of miners heading south for the winter who were stocking up for the journey. She waited her turn at the counter, with a list she'd been refining for a week, and when Mercer finally turned to her, she put it down without preamble. He read it. His eyebrows did the same slight elevation they'd done the first time. You're planning to make it through on this, he said. Alone up there? I am, Lenora said. This is a serious amount of dried goods, he said. Flour, beans, salt, pork. This is what a family lays in. I'm aware of what it is, Lenora said. I also need the lamp oil and the candles on the second line. Mercer looked at her steadily. You know what people in this town are saying. She had expected this would come eventually. Tell me, she said. They're saying you found something in that cabin, Mercer said. His voice was level, not accusatory, more like a man laying out a map, so both parties are working from the same information. Gold, some say. They're also saying he paused, chose his words, that it's not likely to have come to you in any straightforward way. And what do you say? Lenora said. Mercer was quiet for a moment. Then I say that you came into my store with a legitimate gold coin, you negotiated fair, you paid what you owed, and you've done nothing in my observation that requires explanation beyond that. He picked up the list. I also say that the Fenwick property has been on the county rolls for 30 years, and nobody's gone near it. And if something was in that cabin, it was in that cabin before you were born and you found it fair. He said it flatly, without warmth but without hostility. Not defending her exactly, more like establishing a position in the record for his own reasons. That's the truth of it, Lenora said. Good enough for me, Mercer said. He started filling the order. But the conversation stayed with her on the walk, back up, not because it frightened her, but because she understood now that the story the town was building about her was running ahead of the facts, and that stories, once they got enough momentum, became their own kind of truth, regardless of what actually happened. She couldn't control what people said. She could only control what she did and what she was, and let the accumulation of those things eventually become the louder story. She walked back up the mountain in the November cold with 60 pounds of supplies and the particular resolve of someone who has decided to let their work answer for them. She didn't come back down again for 6 weeks. The first real storm hit on the 4th of December. Adelaide's journal had prepared her for the general category of event, but not the specific scale of it. The northern peak had been building clouds for 2 days. And on the third morning, what she awoke to a sky, the color of a bruise and wind that had changed from its usual directional consistency to something that came from 3 directions in rapid sequence, kind of atmospheric confusion that preceded a major system. She spent that entire day doing nothing but preparation, bringing in every piece of wood she'd split and stacked under the lean-to, filling every available container with water from the spring before the cold sealed it, banking the stove carefully, checking the stovepipe collar and every fitting she'd installed, going over the windows and the door frame, and the chinking, one more time. The storm arrived at nightfall. What hit the cabin was not wind in the ordinary sense. It was a concussive force, a thing with weight and intention that struck the north wall in repeated surges and made the logs move against each other in a way she could hear a deep, low groan, almost below the range of sound, that she felt in her sternum more than her ears. She sat beside the stove with Adelaide's journal and tried to read and couldn't concentrate and eventually stopped trying and just sat with her back against the wall, feeling the wall's response to each gust, calibrating. The roof held. The walls held. The windows flexed in their frames once, both of them, hard enough that she went to check each one with a candle after the first major gust, running the flame around the edges looking for air movement. She found none. The glazing compound she'd reworked twice was doing its job. She slept badly in 2-hour intervals and woke each time to the sound of the storm and lay still listening until she satisfied herself that what she was hearing was the storm rather than the structure failing, and then slept again. In the morning, the storm was still going. The door, when she tried it, opened 6 inches against a packed wall of snow and stopped. She spent 20 minutes with the shovel she'd hung inside the door specifically for this contingency, clearing enough space to open the door fully and assess the situation. The world outside the cabin had been rearranged. Drifts 5 and 6 feet high had formed against the north wall and around the lean-to, burying her remaining exterior wood stack to the eaves. The trail she'd worn between the cabin and the spring was gone, replaced by unbroken white. The trees at the edge of the property were bent under the weight of accumulated ice, their lower branches buried. She stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at it. Most of its windows were dark. Then she got the shovel and started digging out the wood stack, because the wood in the cabin would last 3 days at most, and the storm showed no signs of stopping. She worked for 4 hours. The snow was coming down the whole time, not as hard as the night before, but steadily, deliberately, with the mountain's customary absence of concern for human inconvenience. By the time she'd cleared enough of the wood stack to access the interior of the pile, the dry wood underneath, the layer she'd stacked in the protected core her coat was soaked through, and her hands had gone from painful to numb and back to painful again in cycles. She carried load after load inside. stacking it against the interior wall near the stove in the configuration. Adelaide's journal had described enough to maintain temperature without the wood drawing moisture from the cabin air in quantity. She checked the stovepipe for ice formation. At the collar, a risk Adelaide had flagged explicitly, and found a thin skin of ice on the exterior portion of the pipe that she cleared with the poker rod before it could build to a blockage. That evening, with the storm reduced to a hard, steady snowfall and the cabin holding 70-something degrees from the stove, she sat at her table and took stock of herself. Her shoulder was bad. The left one, the old injury, had been objecting since the first hour of wood hauling, and was now making its displeasure known with a specificity and consistency that suggested she'd done something more than aggravate it. She couldn't lift the arm above chest height without a sharp, localizing pain. She worked it carefully with her right hand, pressing along the muscle, trying to determine the character of what she was dealing with. Not structural, she thought. Nothing shifted when she moved it. More likely a torn or badly strained fiber in the rotator area, which was painful and limiting, but not an injury that would get worse with careful use. She made a sling from a strip of heavy cloth and wore it for 3 days. She worked one-handed when she could and two-handed when she had to, and accepted the pain as a fixed cost of the current situation. Storm lasted 4 days total. When it finally cleared, the world outside was utterly, completely silent, the specific silence of deep snow that absorbed sound rather than reflecting it, a silence so total it had texture. She stood outside the cabin on the morning of the 5th day in that silence and looked at the mountains around her, at the way the new snow had reshaped every surface into clean geometric forms. Most of its windows were dark, and she understood something Adelaide had written in the journal that she hadn't fully grasped before. The mountain after a storm is not the same mountain it was before. You must relearn it. She relearned it. She spent 2 days walking her property in the aftermath, slowly, carefully, probing the snow depth with her staff, remapping the terrain under its new layer, refinding the landmarks Adelaide had marked, and verifying them against the altered landscape. She found a place where a tree had come down in the storm, a big larch that had been dead for years and had finally given way, and she marked it because the fallen tree would be firewood. Once it had a season to season further, and because a fallen tree changed the drainage pattern, and she needed to understand how before the spring melt. She was alone, completely alone, for 31 days after the storm. No one came up the trail. She expected no one. But the solitude had a different quality now than it had in October, not lighter exactly, but more familiar, the way any difficult condition becomes more manageable once you've established that you can sustain yourself within it. She read. She worked on smaller projects, a new set of shelves, a simple chair to replace the stump she'd been using at the table, a series of wooden pegs for hanging tools and coats near the door. She practiced the dovetail joint on scrap wood, working it with the draw knife and chisel until she could cut a clean fit joint from scratch in under an hour. She'd always been adequate at it. She wanted to be better than adequate. She thought about what Bram had said once, watching her practice a mortise. The difference between adequate and excellent is time. Time and the decision that adequate isn't good enough. She was making that decision deliberately with each piece of scrap wood she worked. She also found the trouble with the hearth she'd been postponing. The central stone she'd reseated, she'd mortared the edges, set it plumb, tested it had settled again during the frost contraction of the stones below it. Not the same rocking motion as before, because she'd addressed the underlying seating issue, but a hairline gap that had opened along the east edge of the stone where it met the firebox surround, a gap that was drawing cold air directly from the void she'd discovered, the now empty chamber beneath. She pulled the hearthstone again. The void looked exactly as she'd left it. The oilskin-wrapped bundle of remaining coins was undisturbed, sitting in its lined chamber as Adelaide had left it, minus the coins Lenora had spent, which she'd accounted for precisely in a small ledger she kept in the tool bag. She picked up the bundle, set it aside, and spent 2 hours properly addressing the foundation beneath the hearthstone, relaying the flat stones of the void's floor with a finer aggregate fill. Most of its windows were dark, mixing a proper lime mortar from the bag she'd brought from town and had been using for the chimney work, setting it all with the level she'd borrowed from Pike's smithy and not yet returned. When it was done and cured, and she set the hearthstone back. It was seated as solidly as any stone in that structure. She tested it with her boot. She put her full weight on it. She jumped on it once, which probably looked ridiculous, but she needed to know. Didn't move. She replaced the bundle in the void, fitted the stone over it, and sat on the floor beside the hearth for a moment, her back against the warm stone. $480 remained of Adelaide's. $600 she'd spent $120 on the first 2 rounds of supplies and equipment. She'd planned it carefully, and the planning had been correct. She had enough to keep the cabin going through the winter, with money still remaining in spring. Money she had been thinking about carefully. She picked up her carving knife and a piece of clear pine she'd set aside weeks ago, and she began working on something new. Not a peg, not a joint practice, but a small figure of bird, the same rough-hewn mountain bird Bram had taught her with, the one that sat on the shelf above the stove, now in the position her windowsill had always occupied in Edwin's house. She was going to make a better one. She was going to take her time with it. Outside, the mountain was still. Inside, the stove ticked and the knife moved in small, careful strokes, and Lenora worked. It was deep in January when Calder Rusk knocked on the door. She heard him on the trail before he reached the cabin. The sound of snowshoes on packed snow has its own particular rhythm, a dry, shuffling compression, and by the time he got to the door she was already on her feet, with the door cracked, assessing. He was old. Maybe 70. Maybe more the kind of old that happens to people who have spent decades outdoors, weathered into something simultaneously fragile-looking and deeply durable, like old leather. The hide. He was wearing a coat made of elk hide that had seen 40 winters at minimum, carrying a pack frame, 3 beaver pelts tied to it, and his snowshoes were the traditional wood and gut construction that she'd seen pictures of but never used. Stopped when he saw her in the door. "Didn't know anyone was up here," he said. He didn't say it with alarm. He said it with the neutral observation of a man who notes a fact and files it. "Since October," Lenora said. He looked at the cabin. The way everyone who came to this cabin looked at it now, recalibrating against what they'd expected. "Did the repairs yourself?" "Yes." He looked at the stovepipe. "Smart to do the collar before the freeze." "Come in if you want to get warm," Lenora said. It wasn't an eager invitation, it was practical. It was 15 below outside, and the man was old and had been walking in it. He came in. His name was Calder Rusk. He had been trapping these mountains since before Ironwood Pass was a town. He had a cabin 4 miles further north on the ridge, smaller than hers, that he'd built himself 30-something years ago, and he came through this area twice in winter on his trap line. He told her all of this, sitting at the pine table, drinking the tin cup of coffee. She made real coffee, a luxury she'd rationed carefully, and looking around the interior of the cabin with the attentiveness of a man cataloging things as a professional habit. "You knew Adelaide Fenwick?" Lenora said. "Not well," he said. She wasn't what you'd call a socializing person. But she knew this mountain. He wrapped both hands around the tin cup, better than most men I've met. She knew where the deer wintered before I did, and I'd been here 10 years. He looked at Lenora. "She leave anything useful?" "She left a journal," Lenora said. 23 years of observations. Rusk nodded slowly. "That'd be worth having." He looked at the tin cup, then at her. "You know where the deer are wintering this year?" "I have a guess from the journal," Lenora said. "I haven't verified it." "I can show you," Rusk said. "I'm through here again in 2 weeks. If you want, I'll take you to the wintering hollow." "You've got a rifle?" "My grandfather's," she said. "A Winchester at shoot true?" "I think so. I haven't fired it in months." "Fire it tomorrow," he said. "Find out. No sense guessing in that direction." She didn't have the tracking skills to find the deer hollow on her own. Not yet. Not in January, with the mountain rearranged by snow and ice. But Calder Rusk had walked this ground for 3 decades, and he was offering, and she understood that from humans who knew things she didn't know were to be taken seriously, and without the particular pride that confused receiving knowledge with being indebted. "All right," she said. When he stood to leave, he paused at the door and looked back at the interior one more time. Adelaide would have approved, he said. He said it without sentiment, the way he said everything as a factual assessment. Then he went out into the cold and put his snowshoes back on and headed north on the ridge. And Lenora watched him until the pines took him, Most of its windows were dark, and then she went and got her grandfather's Winchester from the cabinet she'd built for it, and checked the action, and loaded 2 rounds, and went outside and fired a knot in a dead larch 40 yards out. The first shot was 6 inches low and left. She adjusted, breathed, fired again. The second shot hit the knot. She reloaded and fired until she understood the sight correction she needed and had confirmed it 3 times in a row. Then she cleaned the rifle and went inside. She was ready. 2 weeks later, Russ came back, and they went together to the wintering hollow. It was exactly where Adelaide's journal had marked it, a south-facing bowl below the main ridgeline, sheltered from the north wind by a natural rock formation, where the snow was shallower and the dried grass still came through in patches, and where 12 deer stood in the early morning gray like statues, steam rising from their breath. Russ put his hand on her arm to stop her at the tree line. She watched the deer for a moment, counted them, assessed the angles and distances and the wind direction, and then made her choice a mature doe, broadside, near the center of the group, the clearest shot with the least risk of hitting anything behind her. She took the shot. The deer dropped cleanly. The others scattered uphill and were gone in seconds. Rusk said nothing. He walked out with her to the deer and helped her with the full dressing. She knew the basic procedure from Bram, but had never done it herself, and his hands corrected her once, silently, showing rather than telling, the way a craftsman teaches. They hauled the deer back to the cabin together on a pine pole sled Rusk had brought and hung it from the lean-to for aging. "You'll need to know where the snares go," Rusk said, when they were done. "For rabbit. Deer you can get twice, maybe 3 times in a winter before you've thinned the herd too far. Rabbit every week, all winter." He showed her the snare locations over the next 2 hours, places Adelaide had known and marked, places Rusk had found independently, and in several cases arrived at the same answers Adelaide had, which told Lenora something about how knowledge of a specific landscape converges toward truth over time. She ran her own snare line for the first time that afternoon, setting 6-wire snares in the runs Rusks had identified. The first morning, 3 of 6 had rabbit. She stood in the snow, looking at the full snares, and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, not exactly pride, but a specific satisfaction that was almost identical to the feeling she got when a joint fit tight and true on the first try. The feeling of getting something right that had been difficult. She reset the snares. She went back inside and made breakfast. Rusk came through 4 more times before winter broke, and most of its windows were dark, and each time he added something to her knowledge of the mountain where the spring runoff channels went, which creek crossings would be safe in April, and which wouldn't, a section of trail above the North Ridge that had a history of late-season slides and needed to be avoided in the thaw. He was not a conversational man. He communicated in specific, functional pieces of information, delivered when relevant and not otherwise, and Lenora found this suited her. The town had existed at the bottom of the mountain the whole time, of course. She'd been thinking about it in the way you think about something you know is there, but have set aside while you deal with what's in front of you. She'd been thinking about it more specifically in the past few weeks as the provisions ran lower and the days ran longer and the light on the south-facing slope outside the window started, almost imperceptibly, to change. She'd been thinking about spring. She'd also been thinking about money. Not Adelaide's gold, which was dwindling appropriately. She'd been careful, and the rate of expenditure was within her projections. She'd been thinking about what came after the gold, because the gold had a bottom. She'd always known that. Adelaide had not given her wealth in the permanent sense. She'd given her time. Time to get established. Time to get the cabin habitable, and her position on the mountain secure, and her skills refined to the point where they could produce income. Question was, what income? From what? She had thought about this at the table every evening for weeks, and she kept coming back to the same answer. She had Bram's tools. She had the skills he'd spent 11 years teaching her. She had a supply of standing timber on her own property that she owned outright, and that was producing no income sitting on the slope. She had spent the past 3 months making herself better at the craft, the joints, the fits, the techniques she'd been practicing on scrap. She had a reputation in Ironwood Pass, whatever kind of reputation it was, and she intended to shape it toward something more useful than mystery. She needed work, real work, paid work, the kind that built a livelihood rather than drew down a reserve. Question was who would hire her. That question had a shape she needed to understand before she walked back into that town, because she knew the answer wasn't automatic. A young woman offering carpentry services in a frontier settlement in 1890-something was not a category that existed in most people's mental models. She would be walking into the gap between what she actually was and what they expected to see, and she needed to do it in a way that didn't give them the opportunity to dismiss the category before they'd experienced the work. She thought about what Bram would have said.
Don't forget about what you can do.
He'd told her once, watching her try to convince a neighbor that she could fix his gate hinge properly. Show them. People argue with words. Nobody argues with a well-hung gate. She needed a demonstration, not a sales pitch. A demonstration. Question was what form it should take. She went to the shelf above the stove and picked up the wooden bird she'd been working on all winter, the new one, not Bram's original. She'd been at it for 2 months, working it in the evenings in the firelight, and it had become something she hadn't expected, not just a copy of Bram's bird, but a more complex piece. The feathers individually carved and undercut, the wings positioned mid-extension, as though the bird had been caught in the moment of lifting from a branch, the feet gripping an oak twig she'd fitted separately and dowelled in. It was the best carving she'd ever done. She knew that without flattering herself. It was genuinely good, the kind of good that stopped people. She turned it in her hands in the stove light. Then she wrapped it carefully in a piece of soft cloth and put it in the tool bag. She was going to take it to town, not to sell it. She had a different idea. The trail was passable in the second week of February. Barely the snowpack was still deep, but settled and firm enough to walk on in the right boots. And Rusk had told her the south-facing sections of the trail had started to clear. She made it down in 5.5 hours, slower than in autumn, stopping three times to let her breathe, regulate in the sections where the footing demanded full concentration. Ironwood Pass looked both exactly the same as she'd left it, and subtly different, the way places look when you've been absent long enough to see them fresh. She was aware of eyes on her as she came down the main street, not dramatically, not in the way of a scene, just the ordinary social alertness of a small town where the return of a known figure is automatically noticed and processed. She went to Mercer's first. Mercer looked up from the counter when she came in, and something in his expression registered something she couldn't quite read, not surprise. Exactly. More like a confirmation. You made it through, he said. I did, Lenora said. She put the carved bird on the counter between them. Mercer looked at it. He picked it up without asking, turned it in both hands, looked at the undercut feathers and the separate twig and the way the feet gripped. He had the look of a man engaged in genuine assessment rather than performance. You made this, he said. This winter, she said. I need work. I'm not asking for it as a favor. I'm asking if you know of any person in this town or the surrounding area who needs quality carpentry furniture, cabinets, repairs, construction. I have the tools, I have the materials from my own property, and I have the skills. She paused. The bird is what I do. Anything structural I build is better than that, because structure has fewer variables. Mercer set the bird down on the counter between them, quiet for a moment, looking at it. Harlan Booth, he said. Miner has a family cabin 2 miles east of town. He came in last month asking if I knew a decent carpenter. His wife wants a proper cradle before their 3rd child comes, which is April by her count. He looked up at Lenora. He's a stubborn man. He'll question you. Let him question, Lenora said. I'll send word you're coming, Mercer said. Leave the bird. She looked at the bird. I'll pick it up when I come back for supplies, she said. Mercer nodded. He put the bird on the shelf behind him, in the middle, where it was visible from the door. She was already thinking about the cradle, already measuring in her head the standard cradle dimensions, the modifications that would make it better than standard, the wood she had on the property, how long the work would take, what a fair price looked like. She walked out of Mercer's into the February cold and stood for a moment on the main street of Ironwood Pass. A woman on the far side of the street stopped walking and looked at her. Not hostile, more like someone verifying something they'd heard. Then the woman continued on her way. Lenora thought about Edwin's voice saying, surely that amounts to something, with that dismissal wrapped in the shape of encouragement. She thought about that for about 3 seconds. Then she turned and walked toward the north end of town to find Pike and pay him back the $3 she owed him for stove storage. And after that, she would get her supplies and go back up the mountain and start cutting the timber for a cradle that she intended to make so well that Harlan Booth would tell every person he knew exactly who built it. She had wintered on the mountain. She had fixed the roof and sealed the walls and installed the stove and dressed a deer and run a snare line and read Adelaide Fenwick's 23 years of hard knowledge and added her own observations to the margins. She had done all of this alone, with the tools her grandfather left her, and the money a dead woman trusted her with, and the particular stubbornness that Edwin Harrow had always called improper in a young woman. She climbed the mountain that afternoon with 60 pounds of supplies on her back, moving steadily, not fast, resting once at the dry creek crossing to drink and to let the load settle before the steep section above. At the top, the cabin sat exactly as she'd left it, the stovepipe rising straight from the new roof, the windows throwing the last of the afternoon light back in clean rectangles. She unlocked the new door she'd made a proper lock plate herself, mortised into the door frame, fitted with a mechanism she'd salvaged from a broken chest lock, and modified, and went inside and got the stove going, and made coffee and sat at her table with a blank page, and started drawing the cradle. Proportions first, then the joinery, then the decorative elements. She was going to carve a series of mountain birds along the side panels, small and precise, the same style as the bird on Mercer's shelf. Not because Harlan Booth had asked for it, because she had decided that her work was going to be recognizable, that when people saw a piece she had built, they were going to know it was hers without being told. That was not vanity. That was a livelihood strategy. Bram had taught her that too. She drew until the candle burned low, and then she banked the stove and took her boots off and lay down on the bunk she'd rebuilt with a proper frame and a rope spring base, and she looked at the ceiling she'd repaired herself and thought about Harlan Booth, asking her pointed questions in front of his skeptical face. She thought that was fine. She had answers. Better than that, she had evidence. And evidence was worth more than answers. She was asleep before the stove had cooled by 5 degrees. Outside, the February wind moved through the ridge pines in long, slow waves, and the mountain sat under its snow in the dark, enormous and indifferent, the way mountains always are. But the cabin's windows were dark now, only because Lenora was sleeping, not because they were empty. That was the difference. And it was not a small one. Harlan Booth was exactly the kind of man Mercer had described, which was to say he was a man who had formed his opinions early and maintained them with the commitment of someone who had invested considerably in being right. He was in his mid-30s, broad through the chest, with the specific wariness of a man who had worked hard his whole life and believed that most problems in the world could be traced back to someone not working hard enough or not being straight about something. He opened the door of his cabin the morning Lenora arrived and looked at her for a long moment before he said anything. She had come down them the day before. She had come down the mountain the day before, stayed the night at Foss's livery lean-to again, and walked the 2 miles east in the early morning cold with the tool bag over one shoulder and the rolled plans for the cradle under her other arm. "You're the girl from the mountain," Booth said. "I'm Lenora Veyne," she said. "Mercer said you needed a cradle built." He looked at the tool bag. He looked at the rolled plans. He looked at her hands, the calloused, rough-skinned hands of someone who had been doing physical work for months. And then he looked at her face with the expression of a man running calculations that weren't coming out the way he expected. "My wife's inside," he said. "Come in." Martha Booth was a small, quiet woman somewhere in her late 20s who was very pregnant and had the specific exhaustion of someone who had been tired for months and had stopped expecting that to change any time soon. She was also, Lenora observed immediately, considerably more observant than her husband. She looked at Lenora come through the door, and something in her face shifted from polite wariness to genuine interest. "Let me see the plans," Martha said, before her husband could say anything further. Lenora unrolled them on the kitchen table. She had drawn them carefully, not just dimensions, but joinery details, the perspective sketch of what the finished piece would look like, and along the right margin, a detailed carving guide for the bird panels she intended for the side rails. Martha leaned over them with both hands flat on the table and studied them for a solid minute. "Birds," Martha said. "Are those the same as the one at Mercer's?" The carved one on his shelf? Yes, Lenora said. I've been looking at that bird for 2 weeks, Martha said, since Harlan mentioned needing a carpenter and I went into town for supplies. I kept thinking whoever made that. She stopped and looked up at Lenora. That was you, that was me, Lenora said. Harlan Booth had been standing to the side with his arms crossed, and Lenora could see him working through something, the particular internal negotiation of a stubborn man encountering evidence that conflicts with a position he's already taken. He hadn't said she couldn't do the work. He just implied it with his face and his posture, and now his wife was looking at these drawings with an expression that was going to be difficult to argue with. What's the wood, he said. Lodgepole pine from my property, Lenora said. Clear-grained, been drying since late fall. I'll use maple dowels for the joints because pine pegs and pine end grain don't hold long-term. The grain compresses and the joint loosens after a few years. Maple into pine holds indefinitely. Booth looked at his wife. His wife was still looking at the bird sketch in the margin. What's the price, he said. $3 for the cradle, Lenora said. That includes the carving. If you want it before April, I need to start this week. Booth uncrossed his arms. He recrossed them differently, which was a small but legible shift. $3, he said. Not repeating it as a complaint, repeating it as someone confirming a number that was lower than they'd expected. $3, Lenora said. When can you start? I already started, she said. I have the wood selected and roughed to dimension. I need 2 weeks of working time in my shop, and then I'll bring it down. Booth looked at her for another moment. Then he put his hand out. She shook it. Martha Booth looked up from the drawings and caught Lenora's eye and gave her a small, private, the kind of communication that moves between women sometimes without requiring words, a recognition of something managed in a particular way. Lenora rolled the plans back up and put them under her arm. 2 weeks, she said. I'll send word with Pike if anything changes. She walked back to the mountain and went to work. The cradle took 16 days, not 14. The delay was not from poor planning. On the 10th day, she was fitting the side rail mortises, cutting the precise rectangular pockets that would receive the tenon ends of the rocking rails, and she found a hidden pitch pocket in the wood she was working, a natural resin inclusion that had been invisible in the rough-cut board and only revealed itself when she got to finished depth. The pitch pocket was positioned exactly where one of the mortise walls needed to be, and resin-saturated wood doesn't hold glue and doesn't hold finish. She could have worked around it. She could have shifted the joint position slightly and adjusted the overall dimensions to compensate. She thought about it for about 20 minutes, turning the board over, measuring the alternatives, holding different solutions up in her mind, the way you hold a physical object to the light. Then she went to the woodpile and selected a different board. It added a day and a half to redimension and recut the mortises. She accepted this without ceremony. The work was for a child. Child would spend its first year in it. The joint needed to be right, not approximately right, and the difference between right and approximately right was a day and a half of her time, and that was what it cost. When she was done with the joinery and the fitting and the initial sanding, she started the carving. The birds on the side panels were the most detailed carving she'd done since the bird she'd left with Mercer. She had 12 of them, 6 per panel. Each one slightly different posture, different wing position, the sequence suggesting motion as though a single bird had been caught at 12 moments in a single flight. She worked them in the evenings by the stove light, the detail work too fine for daytime when her hands were tired from the structural work, the small knife moving in cuts she felt rather than consciously decided. Russ came through on the 13th day and sat at the table with coffee and watched her work for a while without speaking. Then he said, "What are you going to charge for that?" $3, Lenora said, without looking up from the carving. Russ was quiet for a moment. "You should charge more." "I know what I should charge," Lenora said, "and I know why I'm charging 3. He accepted this. He understood it. She thought the economy of establishing a reputation, the way the first few pieces of work were not purely commercial transactions, but also arguments about what her work was worth. And those arguments were made not with words, but with the quality of the objects themselves. He left the next morning and she finished the carving that night. The cradle was as good as anything she'd ever built. She knew it without sentimentality. She had the ability to assess her own work with reasonable accuracy. Bram had trained her to it, had always been honest with her when something was good and equally honest when it wasn't, so she'd developed an internal standard that didn't require external validation to function. The cradle was good. The joinery was tight and square. The surface was smooth to the hand, finished with linseed oil that brought the grain up, warm and amber. The birds on the panels were the best carving she'd done. She loaded it on the pine pole sled and brought it down the mountain herself, which was a significant undertaking because the sled with the cradle on it weighed close to 40 pounds, and the trail in late February was alternately icy and soft and required constant attention. She stopped 4 times on the descent. She fell once, catching herself with the staff and going to one knee rather than fully down, the sled sliding past her and stopping against a pine root. Nothing broke. She checked the carving before she got up. It was fine. She got up and kept going. Martha Booth was at the window when Lenora came up the path to the cabin, and she had the door open before Lenora reached it. Harlan came out behind his wife, and the 3 of them maneuvered the cradle inside. They set it on the floor in the bedroom, and Martha crouched beside it, moving carefully, the way women in late pregnancy move, with that particular caution, and ran her hand along the surface, and then looked at the carved panels. She didn't say anything for a moment. Harlan was looking at the joinery. He crouched beside it, the way Lenora had seen Pike do at the cabin, the way men who work with their hands look at other people's work, checking the specific things, not just the overall impression. He rocked the cradle. He pressed on the joints. He looked at the rocker connection where the side rails met the curved base pieces. "These are pinned with maple," he said. "Through pinned," Lenora said. "Maple tree nails. Draw board so the pin pulls the joint tight as it dries, rather than loosening." Booth rocked the cradle again, deliberately, testing the movement. It moved with the even, quiet sway of well-weighted rockers. He stood up and reached into his coat pocket and counted out $3 in coin and put it in Lenora's hand. Then he added a $4th. She looked at it. "Don't argue," Booth said. He said it without warmth, but without hostility, the manner of a man paying what he considered the actual value rather than what he'd agreed to, because the agreement had been made before he'd seen the work. "Martha, tell her, I've already told 3 women about you." Martha said, still crouched beside the cradle, still looking at the carved birds. "The Hensler family needs a set of kitchen cabinets. The Garvey Ranch has been talking about a new dining table for 2 years, teens, and Ruth Asker's she's got a broken rocker that nobody in town has been able to fix properly." She looked up at Lenora. "I told all 3 of them that there was a carpenter on the mountain who could do the work." Lenora looked at the $4 in her hand. She looked at Martha Booth's face. "I can't get down the mountain every week in winter," she said. "The trail's not reliable until March." "March is fine," Martha said. "Hensler will wait for cabinets. Garvey will wait for a table. He's been waiting 2 years. Another month won't kill him. And Ruth Asker's rocker has been broken for 6 months. So." She made a small motion with her hand that meant, "You see my point." Lenora put the $4 in her coat pocket. "Tell them. I'll be in touch when the trail opens," she said. Martha smiled, a real one, not a polite one. "I already did." March came in hard and then softened, the way Mountain March always did. 1 week of storms, 1 week of something close to stillness, then another storm, then a longer stillness, and in that second stillness, the temperature climbed above freezing for the first time in months, and the snow on the south-facing slope outside the cabin's window began to show the specific gray-blue of active melting. Lenora watched it the way she watched everything on the mountain now, as information, as data about what was coming next. She was already making furniture. The workshop she'd set up in the lean-to extended by 6 feet using lodgepole poles and a secondary roof of split shakes. A project she'd done in a single long day in January was functioning now as a proper working space. Not large, not warm exactly, but protected from wind and snow and equipped with the tools she'd accumulated, the draw knife and fro Pike had brought, the chisels and planes, and the handsaw from Bram's kit, a brace and bit set she'd found at the bottom of Bram's canvas bag that she'd forgotten was there, and the folding rule and marking gauge and combination square that had been Bram's constant companions and were now hers. She was building a blanket chest. Not of its windows were dark, not for anyone in particular, no commission yet for that specific piece, but because she needed to be working, and she had the wood, and she wanted to solve some joinery problems she'd been thinking about since the winter. The chest's corner joints were a modified version of the through dovetail she'd been practicing. She was experimenting with a double-lapped configuration that would give the same mechanical strength, but allow her to orient the grain differently at the corners, making the joint virtually invisible from the outside. She had tried it 4 times on scrap before she tried it on the actual chest pieces, and the 4th attempt was right, and most of its windows were dark, and she transferred it to the actual wood on the 5th attempt with the confidence of something that had been worked through rather than guessed at. This was the process. She had always understood intellectually that craft improved through iteration. She understood it now in her hands, which was a different and more permanent understanding. Came up on the first clear second of March to retrieve the McCallum family's stove. They were back from the east, Parentsla, and had sent word that they'd be at the homestead in 2 weeks. But he arrived with the mule, which recognized the trail to the cabin now and moved without requiring much guidance on the familiar sections, and he stood in the works doorway for a moment, looking at the blanket chest in progress before he said anything. "Who's that for?" he said. "Nobody yet," Lenora said. "I'm working out a joint configuration." He came in and looked at the corner joints she'd cut. He turned a piece over and looked at the back face and the end grain. "Double-lapped," he said. "Modified," she said. "The inner lap runs at 30 degrees instead of 45. Gives me a longer glue surface." He set the piece down and looked at the chest's main panel, which was already fitted and dry assembled without glue, sitting in its configuration on the work surface. He pressed on it at the corner. It didn't move. He pressed harder. He said. She had learned that Pike's hum existed on a spectrum, and this one was on the approving end. "Mercer said something to me last week," Pike said, not turning away from the chest. "He said the Garvey family has been asking around about who would build them a dining table. He told them about you." "Martha Booth told me," Lenora said. "I'm going to see them when the trail's fully clear." "Garvey's got money," Pike said. "Real money, not frontier money. His ranch runs 400 head. He built the big house east of town 3 years ago, hired craftsmen in from the territory capital for the interior work." He turned to look at her. "He's not going to be easy to satisfy." "Good," Lenora said. Pike raised an eyebrow. "If I satisfy him," she said, "everyone will know it." Pike looked at her for a moment with the steady, assessing attention that was his characteristic mode. Then he turned back to the blanket chest. "Fair," he said. They spent of its the rest of the morning moving the stove a considerable effort, because cast iron ranges do not move themselves, and the lean-to workshop had to be partially disassembled to get it out. Pike was efficient and strong and communicated primarily through a system of short directions and physical demonstration, and they got the range onto the mule's pack frame in under 2 hours without anything breaking. When they were done, Lenora made coffee on the smaller box stove she'd bought for the workshop, a compact cast iron unit that she'd got secondhand from a miner leaving for the winter, who'd been glad to take $2 for it, and they stood in the restructured lean-to with their cups. "The town talks about you," Pike said. "I know," Lenora said. "Some of it's not friendly." "I know that too." He looked out at the slope, where the snow was melting in rivulets that carved small channels through the white. "Edwin Harrow came into Mercer's 2 weeks ago," he said. "Came in from wherever he's been. He goes south for winter. Everyone knows that." He was asking questions. Lenora was quiet. "About you," Pike said. "About the property. About what people had seen. What did Mercer tell him?" she said. Her voice was level. She was aware of it being level, which meant she was working to keep it that way. "Mercer told him you'd made several legitimate purchases and conducted yourself like anyone else, with legal tender and a right to do so." Pike drank his coffee. "Edwin said the gold he'd heard about the gold he said it couldn't have come to you, honestly, and that he intended to look into the matter." Lenora set her cup down on the workbench. She looked at her hands. She thought about Edwin at his desk, the ledger, the folded paper, the door that had closed behind her without slamming. "He's going to come up here," she said. "Eventually," Pike said. "That'd be my guess." "All right," Lenora said. Pike glanced at her. "That's all you've got to say about it?" "What would you like me to say?" she said. "He can investigate anything he wants. Adelaide Fenwick left that money in that cabin. I found it on my property. The deed is in my name." She picked up her cup again. "There's nothing to investigate." "That's true," Pike said. "It's also true that men like Edwin Harrow don't always require something to investigate. They require something to dispute, which is different. Lenora thought about that distinction. She thought it was accurate, and she thought Pike was right to name it. There was no fact Edwin could uncover that would change the legal situation. But facts were not always the primary instrument of men like Edwin. Doubt was. Reputation was. The particular power of a man with money and social standing saying, in the right tones, in the right rooms, to the right people, that something was not quite right about this girl and her mountain and her gold. She had thought she'd left Edwin's power behind when she'd walked out the front door in October. She was learning that power didn't necessarily stay where you left it. I have work to do, she said. Not dismissively, she meant it practically. Whatever he does, I have work to do. Pike finished his coffee and rinsed the cup in the water bucket the way he always did. I'll let you know if he comes through town asking again, he said. He picked up the mule's lead. Ruth Asker's rocker, she asked me about it. I told her you'd be down in March. Tell her late March, Lenora said. I want the trail clear before I'm hauling furniture. He nodded and started down the mule, moving with the patient resignation of an animal that has made this trip many times and expects to make it many more. Lenora stood at the edge of the lean-to and watched them go. Then she went back inside and stood at the workbench and looked at the blanket chest. She picked up the marking gauge. She set her mark, picked up the chisel. She went back to work. The Garvey Commission happened in the first week of April, when the trail was clear enough to make the trip reliable, and the valley floor had started to show the first thin green of new grass along the creek edges. Theodore Garvey's ranch house was the largest private structure in the valley, 2 full stories. A proper wraparound porch, glass in every window, a kitchen with a cast-iron range that made the McCallum families look modest. Garvey himself was somewhere in his 50s, lean and sharp-faced, with the manner of a man who had built something significant and assessed every other person and object in the world against that standard. He met her in the front hallway and looked her over the way Booth had, but with different components in the assessment. Booth had been doubting her capability. Garvey was doubting her category, not whether she could do the work, but whether she was the right kind of person for his house. Mercer says you do good work, Garvey said. Mercer's seen one carved bird, Lenora said. Harlan Booth has seen a cradle. I have a blanket chest I made this winter that I can show you. I also have drawings for the table I'd build you. Let me see the drawings, Garvey said. She'd worked on the drawings for 2 weeks. Not because the design was that complicated, but because she'd thought carefully about what Theodore Garvey would want in a dining table, not just its function, but its statement, because a man who built a house like this was making a statement with everything in it. She'd designed something that was structurally conservative and visually considered, a trestle base with through mortise connections that were both exceptionally strong and, when finished, visually interesting, the joint geometry, doing the decorative work that lesser furniture accomplished with applied molding. The top was a full plank surface. She would need to find the right wood for it, with breadboard ends to control seasonal movement, and the detail work concentrated at the apron, where she'd designed a running panel of relief carving that was restrained enough to be formal and precise enough to be impressive. Garvey looked at the drawings for a long time. He turned the page. He looked at the detail sketches she'd done of the trestle joint and the apron carving. What wood, he said. Walnut for the top and apron, Lenora said. I'd need to source it. It doesn't grow at this elevation. White oak for the trestle base. The oak and walnut together will give you visual contrast at the joint that emphasizes the structure instead of hiding it. Garvey looked at the drawings again. Where do you get walnut up here? Mercer can order it from the mill in the territory capital, Lenora said. I've already asked. 3-week lead time. He looked at her. You asked Mercer before I agreed to anything. I needed to know if the material was available before I designed around it, Lenora said. If Mercer couldn't get walnut, the design would have been different. I don't design around materials I can't obtain. Something shifted in Garvey's face. A small shift, but she caught it the look of a man who has been given an answer that he didn't expect and that he respects despite himself. What's the price? He said. She had calculated it carefully the way she calculated everything. Material costs, plus transport, plus her time at a rate that was higher than what she'd charged Booth but still below what the craftsman from the territory capital had charged Garvey for the interior work. She'd asked Pike about that, and Pike had found out without Lenora needing to say why she was asking. $18, she said, including the walnut. Garvey was quiet for a moment. The men who did my interior work charged 30 for less. I know, Lenora said. They charged what they could because they came from away and you needed them. I'm charging what the work is worth because I'm here and I intend to stay. The silence in the hallway lasted long enough that she counted 4 seconds of it. Then Garvey put his hand out. She shook it. He walked her through to the dining room and showed her the dimensions of the space and where the light came from and how many people the table needed to seat, and she measured and took notes and asked 3 questions about preference and one about the height of the chairs currently in use. Because a table built to the wrong height for existing chairs was a piece of furniture that solved nothing. When she left, she stood on the porch of the Garvey house for a moment and looked out at the valley. The ranch land spread east and south, the cattle visible in the far pastures, the mountains rising behind everything. $18 was more than she'd earned in her entire life before October. She had not flinched when she said the number. She was proud of that, not in a showy way, in the quiet, private way of someone who has done a specific hard thing and knows it. She walked to town and placed the walnut order with Mercer. The weeks that followed were the most demanding, and also, in a way she hadn't expected, the most satisfying she had experienced. She was working constantly. The Garvey table was the primary project. But Ruth Asker's rocker had turned out to be a more complex repair than expected, the original joint having failed in a way that required partial reconstruction of the rear leg assembly. And she'd also taken a smaller commission from a homesteader family named Pell, who needed a set of shelving units for their new cabin. She was managing multiple timelines for the first time, which required a different kind of organization than she'd needed before. She made a chart on the back of a large paper, the Garvey table's sequence of operations, the Asker rocker's remaining, the Pell shelving's material requirements, and kept it on the workshop wall where she could see it while she worked. She was not naturally an organized person in the administrative sense. She was organized in the physical sense. Her tools were always in their places. Her most of materials cataloged, but tracking multiple projects with different deadlines and different clients required a kind of planning that she had to work at, rather than do by instinct. She got the timing wrong twice. Once she misjudged how long the walnut needed to acclimate after delivery. Before it was stable enough to dimension she'd planned 4 days, it needed 6, and that pushed the Garvey table back accordingly. She sent word send with Pike, and Garvey accepted the delay without complaint, which was its own kind of information about how the commission was sitting with him. The second time, she underestimated the Pell shelving installation time because she hadn't accounted for the fact that their new cabin walls weren't plumb built by a homesteader who had more determination than training and fitting shelves to an out-of-plumb wall. Required scribing and trimming that more than doubled the installation time. She finished it in a single long day that went past dark, working by lantern light for the final hour, and came out of the Pell cabin to find their oldest son, maybe 12 years old, sitting on the porch steps in the dark, waiting to see if she needed anything. "You don't have to wait up," she said. "Ma said to," the boy said. He had the focused solemnity of a child given a responsibility. She said, "You might need water or something." "I'm all right," Lenora said. She picked up her tool bag. "Tell your mother the shelving will settle for a week before it's fully stable. Don't load the top shelf with anything heavy until then." The boy nodded like he was memorizing it. "Yes, ma'am," he said. She had not been called ma'am before. She was 18 years old, and someone's mother had sent her son to make sure she had water, and that son had called her ma'am. She walked back to the mountain in the dark, which she'd done before, and knew how to do the trail had landmarks she'd memorized, the split boulder, the dead larch, the dry creek, and she thought about the Pell boy on the steps, and about the way that the work was making its way into the community in ways she hadn't fully anticipated. Not just as transactions, not just as money changing hands, but as something that existed in people's houses and daily lives. The booth cradle was rocking a child. The Asker rocker would sit in someone's front room for decades. The Pell shelves would hold jars and books and whatever accumulated life the family gathered. She was making things that lasted. That was the version of legacy she understood, not property, not money, but made objects that kept being useful after the making was forgotten. Bram had known that. His furniture was in houses all over the county where he'd worked, and most of those houses had no idea who'd made it anymore. He'd never seemed to mind. She was starting to understand why. Edwin Harrow came to the mountain in the second week of April. She saw him coming up the trail from the window. His silhouette was distinctive, the particular upright carriage of a man who considered posture a form of character, and he was wearing his town coat, which was the wrong coat for a mountain trail, and was demonstrating this by catching on every projecting branch along the path. He was alone. She put the carving knife down on the workbench and straightened. She thought about what she was going to feel when he got there. She assessed it the way she'd assessed the cabin structure that first day, looking for the actual condition rather than the expected one. She felt a version of the cold clarity she'd felt in the dining room in October, the same clarifying anger, but steadier now, less urgent, less like the first breath after being held underwater, and more like the settled breathing of someone who had been breathing regularly for months. She went to the cabin door and opened it and waited. He reached the clearing in front of the cabin and stopped. He looked at the structure, the repaired roof, the windows with real glass, the new door and its frame, the lean-to workshop with its extended roof, and his expression did something she found interesting. Not shock exactly. More like the particular expression of a man who has been operating on an assumption that turns out to have been wrong, and is taking a moment to adjust. "Lenora," he said. "Mr. Harrow," she said. He came closer and looked at the cabin for another moment. "You've done considerable work here," he said. His voice was neutral, carrying none of the dismissiveness she remembered from October. Neutral was its own kind of information. "Yes," she said. "I'd like to come in," he said. "I have some things I want to discuss." "All right," she said, and stood aside. He came in and stood in the interior and looked around with the same assessing attention he'd given the exterior. She watched him see the stove, the windows, the rebuilt floor, the new shelves, the furniture she'd made. She watched him see, on the shelf above the stove, Bram's wooden bird beside the new one she'd carved, and she watched him look at the new one, specifically the better one, the one with the individually carved feathers and the wings mid-extension, and she watched something move behind his eyes. He sat down in the chair she indicated, at the table, and she sat across from him. The same configuration as October, except that this table was one she'd built herself, and this was one she'd built herself, and this was her house. "People in town are saying you found gold in this cabin," Edwin said. "A significant amount." "People in town can say what they like," Lenora said. "It would constitute a material asset that should have been disclosed as part of the estate settlement," he said. He said it carefully, the voice of a man who had prepared the sentence. "Your mother's estate." "My mother owned this property," Lenora said. "Property passed to me. Whatever was in the property was mine." "That's a legal question," Edwin said. "Not necessarily a simple one." "You had a lawyer look at it," Lenora said. She watched his face. "Before you came up here," a pause. "I looked into the question, yes. And what did the lawyer say?" Edwin's jaw moved slightly. "He said the matter was not entirely clear-cut. What he said," Lenora said, "was that you didn't have a case. Because he would have said otherwise if you did, and you wouldn't have come up here alone without one." She kept her voice even. "You would have sent someone with papers." Edwin looked at her across the pine table. He had not expected this. She could see not the specific argument, not the directness, not the absence of the deference he had apparently expected to find in the girl he'd put out with $20 in a worthless deed. "You've grown very confident," he said. "I've been busy," Lenora said. He looked around the cabin again. He looked at the tools hanging near the door, the workshop visible through the window. He looked at the shelf with the birds. He seemed to be doing the same recalculation that Booth had done and that Garvey had done, though for different reasons and arriving at different places. "What are you doing up here?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. More like a man trying to understand a thing that has refused to fit the category he put it in. "I'm building furniture," Lenora said. "I have 3 active commissions. I have a dining table under construction for Theodore Garvey." Edwin's expression shifted at Garvey's name. Garvey was the wealthiest man in the valley, and Edwin knew it. "Garvey," he said. "Garvey," she said. A silence. Outside, the early April wind moved through the ridge pines. Inside, the box stove in the workshop was audible, a low tick of metal contracting. "Your mother would have been," Edwin started. "Don't," Lenora said. He stopped. "Don't talk to me about my mother," she said, Still even, still level. You don't get to use her name as a bridge between you and me. You took her 4 years, and then you sat at the table the morning after she was gone and went back to your ledger. You don't have standing there. The room was very quiet. Edwin looked at the table surface between them. He was not, she understood now, a man who experienced remorse in the ordinary way. He was a man who experienced situations in terms of their cost and benefit, and he was currently calculating something. She waited. I have no legal claim on the property or its contents, he said finally. My lawyer was clear about that. Yes, I know, Lenora said, but you should understand that I have standing in this town. That you don't, he said. I have relationships, business relationships, social ones. I can make things more difficult for you. She had expected this. She had thought about this exact sentence, or versions of it, for weeks. She had thought about what the true answer to it was, and she had decided on honesty rather than performance. You can try, she said. You probably can make some things more difficult. You might be able to convince some people to think twice about hiring me, at least for a while. She looked at him steadily. But Theodore Garvey commissioned a dining table from me last week. Harlan Booth told me this morning that his cousin in the next valley has been asking about who built the cradle. Ruth Asker's rocker is the best work I've done yet, and she's told 4 people about it. She paused. And the carved bird I left at Mercer's has been sitting on his shelf for 2 months, and people keep asking about it. Edwin looked at her. You can put a story about me into circulation, she said. But the furniture is already in people's houses. The story competes with what they can see and touch and use every day. She met his eyes. I think I know which one wins that competition. Edwin sat with this for a long moment. He was not a stupid man. She had never thought he was stupid. He was calculating and self-serving, and he had made the particular mistake of men who organized their world by category. He had put her in a category and failed to update the category when the evidence changed. But he wasn't stupid. He understood what she was telling him. He understood it with the specific clarity of a man who has arrived to collect a debt and discovered there is no debt. He stood up. I'll see myself out, he said. The door's well hung, Lenora said. You shouldn't have any trouble. He paused at the door with his hand on the latch and looked back at her across the cabin. There was something in his face that she hadn't expected, not contrition, not warmth, nothing that simple. Most of its windows were dark. Something more like the look of a man confronting a fact that reorganized other facts around it and is doing that reorganization in real time and finding it uncomfortable and somewhat final. He opened the door and went out. She stayed at the table until she heard his footsteps fade into the trail sunsense, until the mountain was just the mountain again, and the workshop stove was ticking, and the April wind was moving through the pines. Look, she sat there for a long time. She was not happy, exactly. Not in the way you feel happy when something good has happened. She was something more complicated, the feeling of a thing concluded, a thing that had been hanging in unresolved space since October and had now taken its final shape. Not a triumph, just a completion. She got up and went to the workshop. The Garvey table was waiting. The walnut top panel was dimensioned and laid out on the bench, the grain running the long axis the way she'd planned, the color rich and dark in the April light coming through the workshop's east-facing gap. She picked up the hand plane and ran her thumb along the iron, checking the edge. Sharp enough. She set the plane to the surface and began. The shavings curled up clean and thin and pale, falling to the workshop floor in loose spirals, and the wood beneath the plane revealed itself a surface at a time, each pass showing more of the figure in the grain, the way the walnut's natural pattern emerged only under the tool and not before. Edwin Harrow walked down the mountain, and Lenora Veyne planed walnut in her workshop, and outside the snow continued to melt from the south-facing slope, and the thin green of new grass pushed up through what the winter had left behind. The walnut planed down to something close to perfect over the following 2 weeks, and Lenora was honest enough with herself to know that close to perfect was the actual ceiling for any piece of work done by human hands, and that the craftsmen who understood that were the ones who produced the best work, and the ones who didn't understand. It produced work that was either reckless or paralyzed. She was not reckless, and she was not paralyzed. She planed and scraped and sanded through 3 grits of paper, working with the grain on the long passes and across it on the finish passes, and the surface that emerged was something she ran her palm across. At the end of each session, The way I'd check the temperature of something not to assess it critically, but to feel whether it had arrived at the place it was trying to reach. It had by the last day of April. The trestle base was already finished, and sitting in the corner of the workshop, the white oak joints, cut and fitted and pegged with the drawbore method, the through mortise connections that were both the table's structure and, she believed, its most visually interesting feature. She had spent 3 evenings on the apron carving the running panel of relief work she'd designed back in February, and it had given her more difficulty than she'd expected. The design was restrained a repeated pattern of interlocking geometric forms with a naturalistic vine element threading. And the restraint was the difficulty, because restrained carving requires every cut to be exactly right. There was nowhere to hide mistakes in a design that simple. She had made 4 cuts over those 3 evenings that she immediately recognized as wrong and had to correct before they went deeper, and the corrections were visible to her. Even after sanding, though, she doubted they were visible to anyone else. She mentioned this to no one. The assembly took a full day. She had planned the sequence carefully on paper because large furniture assembly goes wrong when the sequence is wrong. Glue has a working time, and if you reach a step where you need a joint closed before the previous joint has set, the whole thing can rack out of square and there is no recovery from that. She went through the sequence 3 times in her head before she opened the glue pot, and then she worked through it with the focused steadiness of someone who has eliminated every variable she can control and is now simply executing. The table came out square. She checked it from every angle with the folding rule and with sighting along the surface, and it was square and flat, and the joints were tight, and the walnut top had the color and figure she'd selected it for, warm and dark and alive in the way good wood is alive. The grain a record of the tree's years on whatever slope it had grown on before it became this. She sat on the workshop floor beside it when it was done, and her back hurt and her hands were cramped, and she was not to put too fine a point on it, also hungry, because she'd forgotten to eat since morning and it was now past dark. She ate cold beans from the pot and looked at the table. It was the best piece of furniture she had ever made. She knew that, without flattering herself, applying the same internal standard Bram had calibrated in her, the standard that didn't move based on how tired she was or how much she wanted the answer to be yes. The answer was yes, not because it was hers, but because it was good. She thought about the $18. She thought about how that number had felt both large and inadequate simultaneously, and how she'd chosen it anyway, because it was the right number for this moment in her life, and this position in the market, and this particular relationship with a client who would talk to other people. She thought about the fact that she would now charge more, cleaned her tools, and went to bed. Getting the Garvey table down the mountain required a system she hadn't needed before. The cradle had been manageable on the sled. A full dining table, disassembled into base and top, was a different category of problem. The top panel alone was 4 feet wide and 7 feet long and weighed close to 60 pounds. And it could not be flexed or jolted without risking the surface finish she'd spent days achieving. She sent word to Pike through Rusk, who came through in the first week of May on his spring trapline check. Rusk regarded the table with the same quiet attention he gave most things. "That's a serious piece of furniture," he said. "It needs to get down the mountain without the surface getting marked," Lenora said. "Got a flat cart he uses for the McCallum freight sometimes," Rusk said. "Trail's wide enough in the lower section for 2 people to manage it if the footing's right. Can you ask him?" "I'll be through his way Thursday," Rusk said. He looked at the table once more. "That for Garvey?" "Yes." Rusk made a sound that was neither approving nor disapproving, but suggested he was filing the information in a category marked significant. "Word gets around," he said. "Garvey's not the kind of man who keeps a secret about what's in his house. That's why I wanted the commission," Lenora said. He looked at her for a moment with the steady, weathered attention that had never fully resolved itself into anything she could read easily. Then he picked up his pack and headed for the door. "Thursday," he said. "Pike came on Saturday with the flat cart and a hired man from the livery named Thee, who didn't say much, but had the useful quality of being both strong and careful simultaneously. They patted the tabletop in blankets and lashed it to the cart, and the 4 of them, Lenora, Pike, Theo, and the mule who was unimpressed by furniture, brought it down the mountain in 3 hours. Garvey was at the house when they arrived. He came out to the porch and watched them carry the top panel in, and then the base components, and then he stood back while Lenora assembled it in the dining room, fitting the trestle base, setting the top on its cleats, tightening the wooden clips that secured the top to the base without rigid fastening, which allowed the wood to move seasonally without splitting. When it was done, she stood back. The table sat in Garvey's dining room in the morning light, and she allowed herself to think exactly what she'd drawn on that paper back. In February, the proportions right, the material right, the trestle joints doing the visual work she'd intended, the walnut top with the color that made the white oak base look architectural against it. Garvey walked around it. He ran his hand across the surface. He pressed on one corner the way Pike did, the way people who know about made things always test them, looking for the honest condition beneath the appearance. He crouched and looked at the trestle joint from below. He stood up. "I've had work done by men who came in from the capital," he said. "Trained craftsmen, guild-trained, with years of shop experience." He looked at the table. He looked at Lenora. "This is better than what they did." She didn't deflect it. She didn't say it was nothing, or that she'd gotten lucky with the wood. She said, "Thank you," in the same tone she used when she confirmed a measurement receiving information that was accurate and relevant. Garvey reached into his coat and counted out the $18. Then he counted out 4 more and put them in her hand. She looked at the 4 additional dollars. "Don't argue," he said. He said it the same way Booth had, with the same particular impatience of a man paying what a thing was actually worth rather than what he'd agreed to, because the agreement had been made before he knew what he was agreeing to. "What's your next commission?" "The Pell family needs additional shelving," she said. "And I have an inquiry from a miner named Carver who wants a tool chest." "Carver talks to everyone in this valley," Garvey said. "When he sees that tool chest, every working man for 20 miles will know who built it." He looked at her with the sharp, assessing directness of a man who had built a ranch from nothing and understood the mechanics of reputation. "You should think about what you want to be known for. A craftsman who does everything is a craftsman. A craftsman who does one thing exceptionally well is someone people travel to find." Lenora thought about that. "What do you think I do exceptionally well?" she asked. It was a genuine question, not false modesty. Garvey looked at the table. "Joinery and surface," he said. "The structural work is precise and the finish work is unusual. The carving on the apron is the kind of thing people will point at when they bring guests to dinner." He paused. "Furniture, that's the answer. Not repairs, not cabinets, not tool chests. Furniture that people keep for the rest of their lives." She rode that thought back up the mountain. May opened the mountain the way spring opens mountain country, not gracefully, not all at once, but in stages and setbacks. A week of warmth followed by a late snow that closed the trail again for 4 days. Then a week of mud so deep the trail was worse than it had been in January. And then finally, in the 3rd week of May, a morning that was simply and completely clear, the air sharp and clean at elevation in the way that high country air is clean. Clarity that was almost aggressive. Lenora stood outside the cabin in that air and looked at the valley below and the mountains above and thought about what Garvey had said. Furniture that people keep for the rest of their lives. She had been thinking about it for 2 weeks. Not with anxiety, she was past the period of existential uncertainty. Past the time when the central question was whether she could survive on this mountain at all. That question had been answered. The question now was what she was building toward in the longer sense, beyond the immediate commissions and the immediate income. She went inside and sat at her table, her own table, the first piece she'd ever built for herself. Rough in places, the surface not as good as the Garvey top, the joints adequate but not excellent, and she opened the ledger she kept for accounts. The numbers had shifted considerably since October. Adelaide's gold, what remained of it, was $140 she'd drawn it down to cover. The early months before the commission started, and the remaining amount was something she had decided, with increasing clarity, was not going to be spent. Not ever. Not by her. She looked at the number and thought about the letter. I could leave it here, in this house, in trust for the person who proved they valued what I valued. Adelaide had done that, and the thought that had been forming in Lenora's mind for weeks now was that she owed a version of that same thing forward, not in the future, not someday, but now, in whatever small form was possible. She had $140 that was not hers to spend. She had recognized this gradually, the way you recognize things that are true before you have the words for them. Adelaide had not given her money to become comfortable. Adelaide had given her a platform, a floor to stand on, while she built something, and the money was the structure of that floor, not the building itself. The building was the work and the reputation, and the life she was making on this mountain. She wrapped the remaining coins in the oilskins, the way she'd found them, and she put the bundle back under the hearthstone, which had never rocked again since she'd remortar it properly in January. She set the stone. She stood on it. It held. She went to her desk and wrote 2 things. The first was a letter she was not sure she would ever send, addressed to no one in particular. That said, simply, "This money is not mine to use. It belongs to the next person who needs it more than I do. When I know who that is, I will know." The second was an entry in the back of Adelaide's journal, below the last of Adelaide's observations. In her own hand, "My name is Lenora Veyne. I have been on this mountain since October. The cabin is repaired. I am a carpenter. I have added my observations alongside yours, and I will keep adding them. I think you would have been pleased with how the north wall held through January. I think you would have had something useful to say about the Deer Hollow. I would have liked to hear it." She closed the journal. She put it back on the shelf. The summer brought work in quantities she hadn't fully anticipated, and not all of it was manageable. Garvey had been right about Carver. The tool chest she built the miner was a functional piece, solid pine, iron hardware, fitted tray inserts for small tools, and it was not her finest furniture, but it was precise and durable and exactly what Carver had described wanting. And Carver was, as Garvey had predicted, a man who talked. Of its windows were dark. By July, she had more inquiries than she could fulfill at the rate she was working, and she spent a week trying to solve the problem of her own throughput before she admitted to herself that she could not build faster without building worse. And building worse was not something she was willing to do. She turned down 4 commissions in July. She didn't do it easily. She wrote the letters at the table in the evening and crossed out the first draft of each one and wrote a second draft because the first drafts were either too apologetic or not apologetic enough, and she was learning that correspondence was its own craft, and she was not yet good at it. She told each person she was at capacity and gave them an estimated timeline for when she could take their work. 3 of the 4 agreed to wait. The 4th, a rancher from the East Valley named Sutter, wrote back to say he would find someone else, and she wrote back to say she understood and wished him well, and she spent 2 days being bothered by it before she let it go. Could not be available to everyone. This was a fact, and facts did not change because they were uncomfortable. What she could do was get better, faster. Not by rushing, by eliminating the inefficiencies in her process that weren't about quality. The places where she was spending time on problem solving that she'd already done and would need to do again on the next piece. She started keeping a process journal alongside the accounts ledger, writing down solutions to problems as she solved them, how to handle the checking in a particular species, what sequence of operations prevented the tear out she'd been getting on the oak end grain, which sanding sequence gave the best result on walnut versus pine. It was the same impulse Adelaide had had, she realized. The same understanding that solved knowledge belonged on paper, where it compounded. Rusk came through in late June and found her in the workshop and sat on the woodpile outside the door drinking coffee while she planed a chair leg. "People in town are talking about you again," he said. "Still or again," she said. "Different," he said. "Before they talked about the gold and whether you were up to something. Now they talk about the work." She didn't stop planing. "What do they say?" "That you're good," Rusk said. He said it simply, the way he said everything as a reported fact, stripped of editorializing. Some say it grudgingly. Some say it without thinking about it, the way you say something that's just true. He drank his coffee. "There's a woman in town, widow, 3 children, came through from the east last year. Name of Sable. Her oldest boy, about 14, hangs around the smithy watching Pike work. Pike told me he's got a feel for the work, but Pike can't take on an apprentice." Lenora stopped planing. She set the plane down and looked at Rusk. "Pike sent you to ask me," she said. Rusk's expression didn't change. "Pike said it might be worth mentioning." She thought about it while she picked the plane back up and finished the pass. She thought about a 14-year-old boy watching someone work because he couldn't not watch, because the pull of a craft is sometimes that specific and that early, the way it had been for her in Bram's workshop at 7 years old. She thought about what it had meant to have Bram teach her, what it had cost him in time, and what it had been worth to her. "What's the boy's name?" she said. "Nate," Rusk said. She thought for another moment. She had never taught anyone. She was 18 years old, which was a fact she was aware of as a potential disqualification, except that she also knew, with the same internal accuracy she applied to assessing her own work, that she was considerably more skilled than most of the people who might present themselves as more qualified by virtue of age alone. "Tell Pike to send him up on a Saturday," she said. "I'll spend a day with him and see what he's got." Rusk nodded and finished his coffee. "One more thing," he said. He reached into his coat and produced a small object wrapped in cloth and set it on the workbench beside her. "Found this on the trail between here and my place. Must have fallen off someone's pack." She unwrapped it. It was a smooth river stone, gray-green, polished by water into an oval that fit the palm perfectly. For a moment she just held it, feeling its weight. Then she remembered Adelaide's letter. "There is one thing I ask, not as a condition, but as a hope, that someday, when you are able, you might do the same for someone else." She went to the cabin and lifted the hearthstone and took out the oilskin bundle and unwrapped it, and placed the river stone inside with the coins and Adelaide's letter. She rewrapped it. She set it back. She reset the stone. She stood on it. It held. She went back to the workshop and picked up her plane. Nate Sable arrived the following Saturday at 7 in the morning, which told her something before he'd said a word. A boy who arrived early was a boy who wanted to be there rather than had been told to be there. He was tall for 14, with the slightly disorganized look of someone whose body was growing faster than his coordination could fully manage. And he had his mother's quiet watchfulness in his eyes. He stood at the workshop entrance and looked at everything in it for about 30 seconds before he looked at Lenora. "Mr. Pike said I should come," he said. "I know," Lenora said. "Do you know why?" "He said you do the best woodwork in the valley." He said it without flattery in it, just reporting. "Pike's generous," she said. "Come in." She gave him the first hour with no instruction. She simply worked on the chair she was finishing and let him watch, the way Bram had let her watch for the first weeks, because watching with full attention is the beginning of understanding, and the temptation to talk over it was a temptation she'd learned to resist. Nate stood and watched with his hands at his sides and his mouth, and she observed him observing without making it obvious she was doing so. After an hour, she handed him a piece of scrap pine and a marking gauge and showed him once how to set a line. Then she told him to mark the same line on 10 pieces of scrap, consistently. He did it. The first 3 were inconsistent, varying pressure, inconsistent angle. By the 6th, he had it. By the 10th, they were even. She looked at the 10 pieces. "What changed between the 3rd and the 6th?" she said. He thought about it seriously. "I stopped looking at where the gauge started and started looking at where it needed to end up." She looked at him. "That's right," she said. "That's the right answer." She picked up a chisel. "Here's the second thing." She spent the rest of the day teaching him basic chisel technique, grip, body position, the relationship between the bevel and the cut direction, the reason you never force a tool that's sticking. He was not a natural in the raw sense, not a prodigy, but he was something more useful than a prodigy. He was a learner. He could accept correction without stiffening. He repeated operations until they were right, rather than until he was bored. He asked questions that were specific rather than general, the questions of someone who was paying attention to the actual thing, rather than the idea of the thing. At the end of the day, she gave him a piece of pine and told him to come back next Saturday with a completed boxed joint, 2 pieces of pine fitted together at a corner using the finger joint she'd shown. Him in the last hour, no glue, just cut and fitted. "If it fits," she said, "we'll talk about whether this is a regular arrangement." He left down the trail with the piece of pine under his arm, and she watched him go with a feeling she couldn't immediately name. It was close to the feeling she'd had looking at the Pell boy on the steps, the one who'd called her ma'am. Something about the transfer of knowledge, the way it moved outward from person to person in a chain that you couldn't fully see the length of. He came back the following Saturday with a box joint that didn't fit perfectly. One finger was slightly tight, one slightly loose, but was clearly the work of someone who had spent the week practicing, not just trying once and calling it done. There were practice cuts on the wood, small test curves in the margins, where he'd been checking his saw angle before committing to the actual piece. She looked at the joint. She looked at the practice marks. "How many times did you do this before you did this one?" she said. 11, he said. "The 9th one was better. But then I tried to do it faster on the 10th and it went wrong. So on the 11th, I slowed back down." She set the piece on the workbench. "The 9th was better, and you still didn't bring the 9th. You said this one," he said. He touched the pine he'd brought. "I thought you meant the last one." "I meant the best one," she said. "Next time bring the best one." He nodded, taking it in, not defensive. "Every other Saturday," she said. "I can't do every week, I have commissions to fill. You'll work here in the mornings, and you'll take home a practice problem each time. I won't pay you anything for the first 6 months, because I can't afford to, and you won't be producing anything I can sell for the first 6 months anyway. After that, we'll reassess." He nodded again. "One more thing," she said. "Everything you learn here, you teach to the next person who needs it. That's not optional. It's part of the arrangement." He looked at her with a slight uncertainty, the look of someone trying to understand the terms. "Who's the next person?" "I don't know yet," she said. "Neither do you, but there'll be one." She picked up the marking gauge and held it out to him. "Start again. Same line, different piece. And this time, tell me what you're thinking about while you do it." He took the gauge. He set the line. He told her what he was thinking about, haltingly at first, and then more fluently. And she listened, and occasionally said something, and occasionally said nothing, and the day went the way days go, when two people are doing real work together, long and concentrated and unremarkable, and underneath that unremarkableness, something she'd later understand to have been essential. The last major storm of the season hit in the second week of November, a full year after Lenora had first climbed the mountain with her grandfather's tools and $20 from Edwin Harrow and a deed to a ruin. She had not been keeping an anniversary in her mind, not consciously. But when the storm hit, announced by 3 days of building clouds off the northern peak, exactly as Adelaide had described, exactly as she'd now recorded twice, in her own observations in the journal's margins, she found herself thinking about October, about the trail, about the door that hadn't slammed. Storm was bad. Not as bad as the December storm that had buried the woodstack sphinx deep, but serious 2 days of heavy snow and sustained wind, the kind of storm that tested what you'd built and was honest about the results. Spent the first day inside, working on a small cabinet she was building for herself, the kind of work you save for weather that keeps you in. She'd been wanting to build it for months, a proper tool cabinet for the workshop, fitted drawers for the small tools, a panel door with a hand-cut raised panel, the kind of piece that was entirely functional and entirely, without apology, beautiful. Because the two things were not in opposition and never had been. She worked on the panel doors, fielding the angled cuts around the panel's perimeter that allowed it to float in the frame, moving with seasonal changes without cracking. She had done the geometry carefully, and the cuts were going well until the third one, when the plane skidded on the grain, and she took a 1/4 inch of surface off a spot she was going to have to address. She put the plane down. She looked at the skid mark. She picked up the plane and reset the iron and worked the damaged area back, with short, careful passes until the surface was clean and the profile restored. It took 20 minutes, and it was not perfect. She could see where the correction had been made if she looked at the right angle in the right light, but it was sound, and it was close, and the overall piece would not be diminished by it. She was not the kind of craftsman who abandoned a piece because of a mistake. She was the kind who fixed the mistake and understood why it happened, and was less likely to make it again. She went back to work. Outside, the storm moved over the mountain in great rolling waves, and inside the cabin the stove burned steadily, and the windows held, and the walls were silent. The chinking she'd done and redone sealed against every draft she'd found, and several she'd found only after the first winter had shown her where to look. On the second day, between storm bands, she went out to check the wood stack and the lean-to roof, and the stovepipe collar, the same checks she'd done before every serious weather event since October. Everything was as it should be. The collar was clear. The lean-to roof, she'd reinforced it twice, since she built it, had held without shifting. The wood stack had a new cover she'd made from split shakes and a frame, and the wood beneath it was dry. She was standing outside in the break between bands, the sky a flat gray above the ridge, everything very still in the particular stillness that comes between storm systems, when she heard someone on the trail. She turned. It was Martha Booth, which was the last person she'd have predicted. Martha was not a mountain trail person, she was a valley person, a farmhouse and children and garden person, and she was here on a November day, alone, walking up a trail that was already difficult in the best conditions, and was currently moving from difficult to treacherous as the temperature dropped again. Lenora went to meet her at the edge of the clearing. "What happened?" she said. Not hello, not what are you doing here? Because something had brought Martha Booth up this mountain in November, and it wasn't a social call. Martha's face was composing itself, the way faces do when a person has been crying and has decided to stop. Her coat was wrong for this weather, not warm enough, and her boots were already soaked through. Harlan left, she said. Naughty didn't leave. He went to the territory capital for the winter. Business, he says. He's been saying it for 2 months. She stopped. He might not come back. Lenora looked at her. Come inside, she said. She got Martha's wet boots off, and her coat hung near the stove and a blanket around her shoulders and coffee in her hands, and she did all of this without fuss. The way Rusk had always done practical things as a set of problems with solutions, rather than as occasions for performance. Then she sat across the table from Martha and let the silence be what it was. I don't know why I came up here, Martha said. I walked out of the house and I just started walking. The baby, Lenora said. She's all right? With my neighbor. Martha wrapped both hands around the cup. Cradle. I keep looking at the cradle. She stopped. I know that sounds strange. It didn't sound strange to Lenora. It sounded like someone who had an object that represented something that was trying to become the past and was not ready for it to be the past. It's good work, Lenora said. You're allowed to look at it. Martha almost smiled. Not quite. Do you think he'll come back? Lenora thought about the honest answer. I don't know Harlan well enough to say, she said, and I don't think I should guess. No, Martha said. Suppose not. She looked around the cabin interior, the shelves, the stove, the birds on the shelf, the tool cabinet in progress in the corner. You've been up here a year, she said. Almost exactly, Lenora said. Are you glad? Lenora thought about it. Not the automatic answer. She never gave automatic answers to questions she respected, but the real one, which required a moment to locate accurately. Yes, she said. Not in a way that's simple. It's been hard most days. My shoulder still gives me trouble when the weather changes. I got the accounting wrong twice, and it cost me. I made a mistake on a chair leg last month that I had to scrap the piece and restart. She looked at Martha. But I built this. I know what every inch of it cost me to do, and I'm the one who did it. And when the storm hits, it holds. That's, she paused, looking for the precise word. That's not something I could have gotten another way. But Martha looked at her with an expression that Lenora recognized from certain moments in the past year, the expression of someone receiving information that is relevant to their own situation and letting it land rather than deflecting it. I don't know what I'm going to do, Martha said. You don't have to know tonight, Lenora said. You can stay until the storm band passes. The trail's going to get worse in an hour. Martha stayed for 4 hours. They talked and didn't talk in roughly equal measure, the way women sometimes sit together in a difficult time not solving the problem, because the problem wasn't solvable that afternoon, but being present with it together, which was a different and sometimes more useful thing. Lenora made supper rabbit stew from the snare line, the technique Rusk had taught her in January, now entirely natural. The snares set and checked on a weekly schedule she'd built into her rhythm without thinking about it. Martha ate 2 bowls and said it was the best thing she'd eaten in weeks, which Lenora suspected was more about the current state of her home than about the stew. When the storm band passed and the trail was navigable again, Martha put her coat back on and her still damp boots. At the door she stopped. How did you know you'd be all right? She said. When you walked up here the first time. How did you know? Lenora thought about October, the thin coat, the 17 cents, the door that didn't slam. I didn't, she said. I knew I'd done worse with less before, and that I had that were real. Beyond that, I didn't know. She looked at Martha steadily. I don't think it matters whether you know. I think it matters whether you go. Martha nodded slowly. She went out into the gray afternoon and started down the trail, and Lenora watched until the trees took her, and then she closed the door and went back to the tool cabinet. The storm finished overnight, and the world was white and still again in the morning. She did her checks, reset 2 snares that had tripped without catching, brought in wood, got the stove going strong. Then she sat at the table with coffee and opened the accounts ledger and looked at the numbers. A year of it, laid out in columns. The expenditures from Adelaide's gold, $160, all accounted for and appropriate. The remaining $140 untouched, since she'd resealed it under the hearthstone. Income from commissions, the booth cradle, the Asker rocker, the Pell shelving, the Garvey table, the Carver tool chest, and 7 smaller pieces since summer, plus the current cabinet, and 3 commissions waiting for her in the new year. She added it across the bottom of the page. $212 earned in a year. More in the second half of the year than the first, the upward slope of it visible in the numbers. The trajectory clear. She closed the ledger. She went to the shelf above the stove and picked up Bram's wooden bird. Held it in one hand. Then picked up the new one, the one she'd made during winter, the one with the individually carved feathers and the wings mid-extension. She held one in each hand and looked at them. The old one was simpler, rougher. The proportions of it were slightly off in a way that had never bothered her, because it wasn't the quality of the carving that made it matter. It was the hands it had come from, and the hours it represented, and the 11 years it had sat on a Simpson's windowsill in a house that was not her house, keeping something warm, that would otherwise have gone cold. The new one was better work by any technical measure. But they were not in competition. She set them both back on the shelf, side by side, and looked at them for a moment. Then she took the $20 Edwin had given her, the 2 $10 bills she'd carried in her coat since October, that she had never spent, that she had transferred into these small wooden box she'd made in them in the first month, and she set the box on the table and opened it, and looked at the bills. She had not spent them in the way someone preserves a grievance, keeping the evidence of an injury warm and ready. She had not spent them because the act of not spending them had gradually clarified into something she understood more specifically now than she had in October. She had not needed them. She had not needed Edwin's $20, had not needed his charity or his assessment or his version of what she was worth. The $20 had been the measure of his regard for her, and she had survived a full year and built a life and a livelihood without touching a cent of it. That was the only response to Edwin Harrow that meant anything. Not the confrontation at the table in April, not the legal clarity about the gold, not anything that required his attention to have weight. Just this, she had not needed him, had never needed him. The $20 were evidence of that, in the only direction it mattered hers. She closed the box. She put it back on the shelf beside the birds, where she could see it every morning when she got up, not as a reminder of being rejected, but as a record of an independence she had built from the actual ground up. There was a moment, sometime in the deep quiet of that November morning after the storm, when Lesora sat at the table she had built and looked at the walls she had sealed and heard the stove she had connected, and thought about the year behind her, not in any summary way, but in the specific texture of it, the blister over the blisters on her hands, the shoulder that woke her up in January, the moment the hearthstone moved under her boot, the first morning with real windows, Pike's voice saying, "You did a good job on that roof," Martha Booth on the trail in the wrong coat, Nate Sable holding the marking gauge for the first time with his tongue slightly between his teeth in concentration. She thought about Adelaide Fenwick, who had lived on this mountain for 23 years and died without knowing if anyone would ever read the journal or find the box or understand what she'd been trying to do. Adelaide had made a bet on the future with no way to know how it would land. It had landed here, with a girl in a thin coat who had enough sense to check the hearthstone. She thought about Bram, who had taught her the only things that had actually mattered. Not what to think about herself, not who she was or wasn't. He had never dealt in that currency. Had always talked about the work, the joint, the fit, the surface, structure, and in doing that had given her something more durable than self-regard. He had given her a standard, and the standard had turned out to be transferable to everything. She thought about her mother, briefly and specifically, in the way you think about someone who is gone in the real, rather than the sentimental sense, not the idea of them, but a specific moment, The particular smell of her, a thing she'd said once in the kitchen in Edwin's house that Lenora had barely registered at the time and now remembered with precision. You're going to be fine, Lenora. I know you can't hear that right now, but it's true. She'd been talking about the school situation, some ordinary difficulty, not a premonition. But it had turned out to be true in the larger sense, and Lenora thought about her mother knowing it about her before she knew it about herself. She did not find this comforting exactly. She found it accurate, which was a different thing, and in her experience more useful. The stove burned. The walls held. The windows, the ones she'd installed herself in the second week she was here, with oil-glazed putty she'd mixed from linseed and chalk, held the cold outside in the clean, absolute way of something built to do a specific job and doing it. She got up from the table and went to the workshop. There was a tool cabinet to finish. There was a commission in the new year, a bedroom set for a family coming into the valley in spring who had heard about her from Garvey and written a letter that she'd answered with careful, specific questions about dimensions and wood preference and intended use. There was Nate Sable, who would come next Saturday with whatever he'd practiced on that week, and she would look at it honestly and tell him what was good and what wasn't, the way Bram had taught her, because a teacher who only encourages produces students who are only comfortable, and comfort how was not the thing she was trying to give him. There was the mountain, which would have another winter, and she would have it with the mountain, her second one, which would be different from the first in ways she already partly knew and partly didn't, the way every hard thing you've already done once is different the second time, not easier, but known. The difference between a difficulty and an uncertainty is significant. One you endure, the other you navigate. She picked up the hand plane. She set to the iron. She checked it with her thumb, the same quick calibration that had become as automatic as breathing the sensitivity in the fingertip that could feel the iron's edge condition without seeing it, the knowledge in the hand that had taken a year to develop and would take the rest of her working life to fully develop further. She set the plane to the panel door's surface. She pushed through. The shaving came up clean and thin and curled away from the iron in a single, unbroken ribbon, pale and almost translucent, falling to the workshop floor. She ran another pass. Another. The surface revealed itself under the plane, the way surfaces do not added to, but found, the finished thing always having been inside the rough thing, waiting for the work that would uncover it. Outside, the storm had left the mountain covered in new snow that was already catching the first pale light of the morning, and the ridge pines stood in the white stillness, and below in the valley, the smoke from Ironwood Pass chimneys was beginning to rise in the still air, thin and gray and alive. Inside the workshop on the mountain, Lenora Veyne ran the plane, and the shavings fell, and the wood gave up its surface one pass at a time, and she worked. She had inherited a ruin and made it a home. She had taken a dead woman's savings and built a livelihood. She had walked into a wilderness at 18 with a thin coat and her grandfather's tools and the stubbornness that Edwin Arrow had always called a flaw, and she had discovered in the way you discover things that turn out to have been true all along, that the flaw was the foundation. It was not a clean story. She had made mistakes, and some of them had cost her real time and real money. Her shoulder would always bother her in cold weather. She had turned away work she needed because her pride was occasionally sharper than her judgment. She had nights still when the solitude of the mountain pressed against her with a weight that was not romantic and not instructive, just heavy. But the cabinet was taking shape under her hands. The joint was tight, and the panel floated correctly in its frame, and the surface was clean and true, and she had made all of it, and it was hers, and it was good. The worthless things had turned out to be the only things worth having. Plane moved. The shavings fell. The morning came on over the mountain, and Lenora worked.